This is a work of complete fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, organizations, events, and locations are entirely invented. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is coincidental. I'd rather walk away than trust you, she said, then married his powerful father. Adrian Vale smiled at the cameras while his hand tightened around Lena's wrist hard enough to leave marks. Not the grip of a man who loved her, the grip of a man who needed her to stay in the frame. The photographers were still flashing. The guests were still laughing. The champagne was still cold, and Lena Hart stood in the center of her own engagement party, wearing a dress Adrian had chosen. Jewelry Adrian had selected. Smiling a smile she had practiced until it stopped feeling like hers while somewhere inside the building, men she'd never met were signing documents that carried her name. Documents she had never seen. Documents that were about to destroy her. If you've ever stood in a room full of people and realized you were completely alone, stay with me. Because this story is about a woman who had to lose everything she thought she wanted before she finally found what she actually needed. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button so stories like this one keep reaching you. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the night that changed everything. Part 1, the party had been Adrian's idea from the beginning. He'd booked the venue 6 weeks in advance, a penthouse event space 40 stories above the city, all glass and ambient lighting, and the kind of minimalist furniture that costs more than most people's cars. He'd hired the florist, approved the menu, reviewed the guest list 3 times. He'd even picked the photographer, a man named Brett, who specialized in what Adrian called natural candid shots, but which always somehow ended up being portraits that centered Adrian perfectly in every frame. Lena had let all of it happen. That was the honest truth, and she knew it even then. She'd told herself it was because she didn't care about the details of a party, that what mattered was the life they'd build after. She'd told herself Adrian's need to control the presentation was just efficiency, just competence, just the way a man like him operated. What she hadn't let herself say out loud was that she'd stopped being consulted somewhere around the 3rd week and had started to feel like a guest at her own engagement. She was 29 years old. She'd spent 4 years building a financial compliance consultancy from a 2-person operation into a firm with 11 staff and a client list that included regional banks and mid-size investment funds. She was good at reading numbers, good at reading risk, good at spotting the precise moment that looked solid on paper was actually hollow underneath. She had missed every single sign with Adrian. That was the part she'd have to live with later. She was standing near the bar when she first felt something was wrong. Not a dramatic moment, not a revelation. Just a small shift the way the air in a room changes before a storm, subtle enough that most people don't register it until the first crack of thunder. One of Adrian's associates, a man named Gareth, who handled mid-level accounts at Vale Consolidated, glanced at her from across the room with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Not surprise, not curiosity. Pity. She turned away before processing it. Picked up her water glass, adjusted her smile, accepted a compliment from a woman she barely knew about her dress. But the feeling stayed, lodged somewhere behind her sternum like a splinter. By 8:30, the formal portion of the evening had started. Adrian's toast, the brief remarks from his business partner Daniel Ewan, the polite laughter at the right moments. Lena stood beside him and delivered her own short speech, warm and real, because despite everything she was telling herself that night, she had genuinely loved him once. That wasn't nothing. But when he squeezed her hand on stage, she felt it again. The grip. A fraction too tight. The hand of a man performing, not celebrating. She slipped away to the restroom just after 9 and took longer than she needed to. Not because anything was wrong physically. Because she needed 30 seconds alone, and in her own life, she had to steal those 30 seconds like they were contraband. The hallways outside the main restroom was quiet. Carpeted, dim, flanked by closed service doors. She stood there for a moment, just breathing, her heels off, holding them by the straps in her left hand, and she let herself think the thought she'd been suppressing all night. Something is wrong. She didn't know what. She had no evidence. She had a feeling and a career built on risk assessment, and 4 years of watching Adrian operate in the space between what was said and what was actually meant. She put her shoes back on and went looking for him. She found him in the second corridor to the left of the main hall, a service hallway she'd noticed earlier, only because the door to it had been propped open with a champagne crate. Adrian was there, Daniel Ewan was there, and a third man she didn't recognize, 50s, suit wire-rimmed glasses, carrying a leather portfolio and speaking in a voice low enough that she caught only fragments, already processed through the Heart Compliance entity. Federal window closes at the end of the quarter. Her signature matches the authorization records, so if there's any investigation, the trail terminates at. Adrian saw her first. The microexpression lasted less than a second, pupils contracting, jaw tightening, the involuntary physical response of a man who has just been caught, and then the professional mask came back down so fast that if she hadn't spent 4 years learning his face, she would have missed it entirely. Lena, his voice was smooth, I was just coming to find you. The Heart Compliance entity, she said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't move from the doorway. Adrian smiled. It's a technical thing. Daniel was explaining a structure we'd discussed. My company, she said. You used my company's name. The man in the gray suit started to close his portfolio. Don't, she said to him. Not loudly. But something in her voice made him stop. She looked at Daniel, who had gone very still in the particular way of men who know they're about to be collateral damage in someone else's disaster. Then she looked back at Adrian. Tell me what you did, she said. All of it. Right now. No performance, no version of it you've cleaned up for public consumption. Tell me what you actually did. He tried 3 different versions. The first was the gentle lie that he'd used her company name only as a structural placeholder. Standard practice, nothing material had flowed through it. She was overreacting. She said nothing. The second was the rationalization that the structure was technically legal, that compliance entities were routinely named in frameworks like this, that plenty of firms operated this way, and she knew it from her own work. She said nothing. The third was the appeal that he'd done it for them, for their future, that there was a timeline and a pressure she didn't fully understand, that he was going to tell her he'd been planning to explain it after the party when the dust settled. And that was the version that broke something. Not because it was the worst lie, but because it was the most practiced. Because she could hear in it the architecture of a man who had already rehearsed the conversation, who had already anticipated her reaction and built a script designed to move her from anger to understanding in as few exchanges as possible. He didn't love her enough to tell her the truth. He loved her enough to have planned how to manage her when she found it. Fix it, she said. Adrian blinked. What? You said you can fix everything. That was the first thing out of your mouth. So fix it. She looked at him steadily. Explain to me specifically how you intend to remove my company's name from every document it appears in, restore whatever funds moved through or were attributed to it, and ensure that when federal regulators come looking, because they will, my firm is completely clean. A silence. That's not, Adrian started. Simple, she said. Or it's not. Which is it? He looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at the floor. Lena, Adrian stepped toward her. You need to understand the position I'm in. I understand the position I'm in, she said. Your name is on nothing. Mine is on everything. He stopped. She looked at the ring on her left hand. 2 carats, emerald-cut, platinum band. He'd proposed with it at a restaurant she'd chosen, which had felt at the time like a meaningful concession. She understood now that he'd allowed her to pick the restaurant because he'd already decided every other thing about their life. She took the ring off. Lena, I'd rather walk away, she said, than trust a man who thinks managing me is the same as respecting me. She held the ring out. He didn't take it, so she set it on the crate next to the propped open door, next to the champagne. Then she walked out. The main hallway was still full of noise from the party laughter, the clink of glasses, someone's voice freezing in the particular register of a man who has had enough to drink that he thinks he's more interesting than he is. Lena walked through it without stopping, grabbed her coat from the rack near the elevator bank, pressed the button for the lobby. She stood in the elevator and didn't look at herself in the mirrored doors. Lobby was quiet. Marble floors, a security desk, one of those enormous floral arrangements that hotels use to signal that your time here is expensive. She pushed through the revolving door into the cold air and stood on the sidewalk and breathed. She hadn't cried. She wasn't sure when she would. The thing inside her chest wasn't grief yet. It was something more immediate, sharper, the specific alertness of someone who has just recognized a danger they were standing directly inside. Her company, her name, her signature on record she'd never seen. She needed a lawyer. She needed to get to her office tonight and pull every document, every filing, every authorization on record for Heart Compliance Solutions. She needed to know exactly what had moved through her firm's accounts and when and where it had gone. She was reaching for her phone when a car pulled up to the curb. Not a car. An SUV, matte black tinted windows, the kind of vehicle that was assembled by people who understood that the point wasn't to be flashy. The back door opened. The man who stepped out was not what she expected. She'd heard Adrian mention his father exactly twice in 4 years. Once when she'd asked directly, and Adrian had said they were estranged, that Marcus Vale was a controlling man who'd made Adrian's childhood a strategic exercise, that he wanted nothing to do with that particular legacy. The second time was indirect, a comment about the company's founding years, the original structure. A dismissive reference to the old guard that she'd understood was about his father without the name being said. Marcus Vale was 62 years old. He was a large man, not in the obvious theatrical sense, but in the way that some people occupy physical space with a kind of settled gravity, as though they've long since stopped needing to announce themselves. He was wearing a dark coat over a suit. No tie. His hair was silver and cut close. He looked like a man who had been through something specific and survived it with his posture intact. He looked at her with eyes that had already seen too much of people to be surprised by much. "Miss Hart," he said, "I'm Marcus Vale." She stared at him. "I know who you are. Then you know Adrian called me 3 weeks ago and told me you were brilliant, difficult, and probably the best thing to happen to him." A pause. He meant it as a warning. She said nothing. "I've been in the building for 2 hours," Marcus said. "I came to see him. I didn't announce myself because I wanted to understand the room before I walked into it." He looked at her steadily. "I saw enough. I don't need a rescue," she said immediately. "I know." He said it simply, without flinching. "I'm not offering one." She almost left anyway. She had her phone in her hand and a driver she used through an app, and enough professional instinct to know that getting into a car with the estranged father of the man she'd just left was not a choice a sensible person. Made it 9:45 at night on an empty sidewalk. But Marcus Vale didn't push. He didn't move toward her. He stood where he was and said, "What he built, with your company name, it's the surface. The structure underneath it is larger and older than whatever Adrian told you. And if the investigators get to you before you understand what you're actually inside, it won't matter that you were deceived. The exposure will stick." She looked at him. "I'm not asking for your trust," he said. "I have no right to that. I'm asking for 30 minutes. In a public place of your choosing, with your own people present if you want them. And if nothing I say is useful, you leave." "Why?" she said. "Why are you doing this?" He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that isn't hesitation, the kind that comes from actually considering the question. "Because I built something that my son turned into a weapon," he said, "and the weapon is pointed at someone who had nothing to do with building it." That was the moment she decided. Not because she trusted him, not because she believed he was a good man, but because the answer was specific and it didn't ask her for anything in return. 30 minutes, she said. "I picked the location." Of course. They went to a diner 6 blocks from the hotel. All-night place, the kind with laminate countertops and coffee that had been sitting on the burner since 6 p.m., and the particular warmth of a space that doesn't try to be anything other than what it is. Lena chose a booth with sightlines to both exits. She texted the address to her assistant Priya with the message, "I'm here. If you don't hear from me in an hour, send my lawyer." She showed Marcus the text before she sent it. He nodded. "Good." She ordered black coffee. He ordered the same. "Start from the beginning," she said. "Not your son's beginning. Yours." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise, but a recalibration, the look of a man adjusting to someone who already knows which question to ask. "I built Vale Consolidated over 30 years," he said, "starting with 3 contracts and a borrowed office. I made mistakes. I made decisions that I justified with results. I hurt people I should have protected, starting with my wife and ending with my son, though with Adrian it was more complicated than hurt. I gave him every advantage and taught him almost nothing about what those advantages actually cost." "You're confessing," she said. "I'm contextualizing," he said. "So you understand that I'm not telling you Adrian is a bad man who came from a good family. I'm telling you that I created an environment where what he became was possible. There's a difference between possible and inevitable." "Yes," he said. "And the difference is choice." He made his... She wrapped her hands around the coffee mug. It was hot enough to ground her. "Tell me about the structure." He talked for 38 minutes. Not 30. She tracked it. What he described was a scheme that had been operational for 14 months, a layered financial architecture designed to siphon funds from Vale Consolidated subsidiary accounts through a series of third-party compliance entities. The money moved slowly, in increments calibrated to stay beneath the thresholds that triggered automatic audit flags. The compliance entities were small firms, some real, some shell constructions. Their names rotated to spread exposure. Heart Compliance Solutions had been added to the rotation 8 months ago. Not randomly. Not because it was convenient. Because someone inside the scheme had identified Lena, specifically her relationship with Adrian, her firm's legitimate standing, the fact that her signature on authorization records would be difficult to challenge, given that she was the principal consultant her clients actually trusted. They chose me, she said when he finished, because being Adrian's fiancée made me look complicit by proximity. And because your firm's track record made the documents credible, Marcus said. A shell company gets flagged immediately. A real consultancy with 8 years of clean federal filings looks like due diligence. Who built the structure? Adrian didn't build this alone. No, a pause. His co-architect is a man named Raymond Tisch. He's been my chief operating officer for 11 years. I hired him when he was brilliant and hungry, and I thought I was getting a partner. What I got was a man who spent a decade learning exactly how to dismantle everything I have built and transfer it to someone who'd give him a permanent seat at the table. Lena stared at him. Your COO, yes. And you have evidence of this. He reached into his coat and laid a USB drive on the table between them. 14 months of transaction records, internal communications, and 3 recordings of conversations between Tisch and Adrian that I made legally under the terms of my own corporate surveillance policy. He left the drive on the table, didn't push it toward her. I'm not asking you to use this for me. I'm showing you it exists because you need to know what the actual record looks like before you go to your own lawyer. She looked at the drive. You could have gone to the federal authorities already, she said. Why haven't you? Because the moment I do, the story becomes about me and Adrian. Father and son, empire and heir, the spectacular implosion of a dynasty. He met her eyes, and you get caught in the debris. Whatever the investigators find on your company's name gets absorbed into the larger narrative, and clearing you becomes a footnote in someone else's case. So you need me. I need you to understand the full picture, he said carefully. What you do with that is your decision. She took the USB drive. She didn't commit to anything else. She called Priya from the diner parking lot and said, "Get me on a call with Gerald first thing in the morning." Not his assistant. Gerald directly. Gerald Marsh was the attorney she used for contract law, but more relevantly, he'd spent 12 years as a federal compliance prosecutor before moving to private practice. He understood exactly the kind of architecture Marcus had just described. She sat in the back of the car on the way to her apartment and didn't listen to music or check her messages or do any of the automatic things she usually did when her brain needed a rest. She just looked out the window at the city, moving past in the dark, and let herself feel the full weight of what the night had been. She had planned to marry a man she'd spent 4 years building a life with. She had walked out of her own engagement party. She had sat in a fluorescent-lit diner with his estranged father and received the kind of information that changed the shape of everything she thought she'd understood. And she wasn't afraid. That surprised her. She'd expected fear, the particular dread of someone watching their professional life and personal life implode simultaneously. But what she felt instead was something colder and clearer than fear. Anger, partly. But underneath the anger, something that had been dormant for longer than she'd admitted to herself. The specific alertness of someone who has been underutilized, finally given a problem that actually requires everything she has. She pulled out her phone and sent Marcus Vale a message. Tomorrow, 7 a.m., same diner. I have questions you haven't answered yet. His response came back in less than 2 minutes. I'll be there. She didn't sleep much. She spent the first hour at her kitchen table with her laptop and a legal pad going through everything she could access remotely from Heart Compliance Solutions, records the authorization logs, the engagement letters, the account activity summaries. She was looking for the seams, the places where something that looked like her work was actually someone else's construction, wearing her firm's name. She found 3. They were subtle. They would have been invisible to someone who hadn't built the system herself, who didn't know the specific shorthand she used in internal memos, who didn't know that she always generated engagement letters in a particular sequence, with a file naming convention she'd developed herself and never documented anywhere. The documents that carried her company's name for the Vale subsidiary accounts didn't follow that convention. Someone had mimicked her style. They'd done it well enough to pass a surface audit, well enough that an investigator unfamiliar with her internal operations would have no reason to flag them. But she was familiar with her internal operations, and the mimicry had gaps. She photographed every screen, saved every file, backed up everything to 3 separate locations. At 1:30 in the morning, she made a cup of tea she didn't drink and stood at her kitchen window looking at the lights of the city below and thought about Adrian. Not with grief, not yet. With the particular clarity of someone who has just survived something and is still in the process of understanding exactly what it was. She thought about all the times she'd watched him charm a room and told herself that the charm was separate from the man, that the performance was a professional tool and the private version of him was different. She thought about the way he'd held her hand at functions, slightly too present, slightly too intentional, the hand of a man maintaining a picture rather than reaching for a person. She thought about the engagement ring, sitting on a champagne crate in a service corridor 40 stories south of the city, and wondered if anyone had picked it up. She thought, he is going to be very, very angry. And then she thought, good. Gerald Marsh arrived at her apartment at 6:45 the next morning with a large coffee and the particular focused expression of a man who had prosecuted enough complex cases to recognize from a single 3-sentence text message that this was serious. She walked him through everything in 90 minutes. The conversation with Marcus, the USB drive which she had not yet opened, wanting Gerald present when she did the 3-document anomalies she'd found in her own records, and her reconstruction of how her firm's name had been integrated into the scheme. Gerald listened without interrupting. He had a yellow legal pad and a ballpoint pen, and he wrote things down in the cramped abbreviation-heavy shorthand of someone who learned to take notes before voice recording was ubiquitous. When she finished, he capped the pen. The good news, he said, is that the fabrication is detectable. You've already found 3 inconsistencies on a remote access review. A forensic audit of your actual systems will find more. The authorship trail on those documents, whoever constructed them left fingerprints. And the bad news? The bad news is that until that audit is complete and the results are in front of regulators, your company's name is on a federal exposure. That means the moment this goes public, which it will, because these things always do, you'll be a named entity in a financial misconduct investigation, and the press doesn't wait for audit results. Adrian will make sure I look as implicated as possible, she said. Almost certainly. Gerald looked at her. Do you want to tell me about Marcus Vale before we open that drive? She told him everything she'd noticed. Marcus's specific language, the way he'd answered her question about his motive, the fact that he'd given her the drive without conditions. Gerald listened to all of it and then said, he could still be using you. I know, she said. His interest in clearing your name and his interest in destroying his son's position at the company are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they align perfectly. I know that too. She met Gerald's eyes. But right now we have the same problem and we have the same evidence. I can use that without trusting him. Gerald considered this. You've done risk assessment for a long time. Since I was 23. Then you know that the most dangerous position is the one where you're the last person to understand what game you're in. I was the last person last night, she said. I'm not anymore. Gerald picked up the USB drive. All right, he said. Let's see what Marcus Vale actually has. What they found on the drive took 3 hours to work through. Not because the records were unclear. They were exceptionally organized, formatted, with the precision of someone who had been quietly building a legal case for months, cataloged by date and entity and transaction type. Someone had done this carefully, methodically, with patience that went far beyond a reactive response to a son's betrayal. Marcus had been watching this happen for a long time before he'd moved. That was interesting. She filed it. The substance of what the record showed was exactly what Marcus had described in the diner: 14 months of systematic fund movement through a web of compliance entities, calibrated to avoid detection thresholds, routed through accounts structured to create the appearance of legitimate consulting fees and vendor payments. The communications between Adrian and Raymond Tisch were clinical and professional on the surface, the language of men who knew they were being recorded somewhere and had developed a code of plausible deniability. But the pattern, read across dozens of exchanges, was unmistakable. The goal wasn't just to take money. The goal was to create a crisis severe enough to force a vote, a board-level challenge to Marcus's continued leadership, supported by manufactured evidence that his judgment was compromised and his company's financials were unstable. Remove Marcus. Install Adrian with Tisch as the permanent operational architecture behind him. It was a coup. Constructed over more than a year, inside a company Marcus had spent 3 decades building. Tisch has been with him 11 years, Lena said. Long enough to know everything, Gerald said. Long enough to know where every body is buried. She looked at the screen. Adrian didn't build this alone. He's not this patient. The patient is Tisch, which means Adrian is the face and Tisch is the actual architect. And if it falls apart, Adrian is the one holding all the visible pieces. She exhaled slowly. They'd throw him to the investigators and Tish would surface somewhere else with clean hands. Gerald looked at her. Do you think Adrian knows that? She thought about the service corridor. The three versions of the explanation. The practice quality of the appeal. I think he thinks he's Tish's partner, she said. I don't think he understands that he's the expendable one. At 7 a.m. she was back at the diner. Marcus was already there, same booth, same coffee untouched. She slid in across from him and put her legal pad on the table between them. Your COO is planning to use your son as a scapegoat, she said. I need to know if you knew that when you came to me last night. He didn't hesitate. I suspected it. I couldn't confirm it until the communication records were fully analyzed. Have you analyzed them fully? My own legal team did. 3 weeks ago, a pause. Tish has constructed a severance for himself. If the scheme is exposed, he has a documentation trail designed to show that he was implementing Adrian's directives under duress, that he raised compliance concerns internally that were overridden. He's the reluctant executor. Adrian's the architect. That's not what the actual records show. No, but it's what Tish's version of the record shows. And he has 2 sets. She stared at him. He anticipated you'd come for him with the original, she said. He anticipated I'd come for him with something, Marcus said. He's been watching me watch him for 6 months. He knows I know. We've been waiting to see who moves first. And Adrian doesn't know any of this. Adrian thinks he and Tish are aligned. Adrian thinks the plan is proceeding on schedule. He has no idea that Tish is already 2 steps ahead of him in a different direction. She sat back. The coffee was bad and she drank it anyway, because she needed the heat and the focus and simple anchor of something real in her hands. You came to me last night, she said slowly, because you needed someone who could authenticate the original records in a way that your own team can't. He waited. Your legal team is internal to Vail Consolidated. Anything they produce, Tish will challenge as self-interested. But a federal compliance consultant with 8 years of clean filings, whose own company's name appears in the fraudulent structure as a victim of forgery, she's not an interested party. She's a witness. You already understood this, Marcus said. It wasn't a question. I understood part of it on the sidewalk last night, she said. I understand the rest of it now. She looked at him across the table. Morning light through the diner windows, the sounds of the city outside, the smell of burnt coffee and someone else's eggs. I'm not doing this for you, she said. I'm doing this because my company's name is on documents I didn't author, and I want it removed. And the most effective way to accomplish that is to be part of the process that exposes where those documents actually came from. I understand. I will share evidence with my attorney and cooperate with any federal investigation. I will not take direction from you. I will not run my legal strategy past you. And I will not owe you anything when this is finished. Those are fair terms, Marcus said. They're not terms, she said. They're facts. He looked at her steadily. For the first time, something in his face shifted, not the recalibration of a man managing a situation, but something quieter and less calculated than that. My son was wrong about you, he said. He said you were brilliant and difficult. He left out the part where difficult just means you refuse to be managed. Most powerful men can't tell the difference, she said. He picked up his coffee. Most powerful men aren't looking for it. She didn't respond to that. She pulled the legal pad toward her and uncapped her pen. I want to walk through the board structure, she said. If we're going to do this, I need to understand exactly where the votes live and what it would take to call an emergency session. Marcus set his cup down and leaned forward, and they got to work. This is a work of complete fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, organizations, events, and locations are entirely invented. Part 2, the board structure of Vail Consolidated, was not complicated. It was worse than complicated. It was simple in the way that a trap is simple, elegant on the surface, ruthless underneath, designed by someone who understood that the most effective mechanisms are the ones that look like they're doing something other than what they're actually doing. Marcus laid it out on a paper napkin because neither of them had brought anything more formal, and because Lena had learned years ago that the people who actually understood complex systems could always explain them on the back of something disposable. 9 board members. 4 were legacy appointments, people who had been with Vail Consolidated since the early years, who owed their positions to Marcus directly and whose loyalty, while genuine, was the loyalty of men who had been comfortable for a very long time and had developed a strong instinct for self-preservation. 2 were independent directors, brought in 5 years ago to satisfy institutional investor requirements, technically neutral but practically cautious. 1 was a financial industry representative whose fund held a significant minority stake. One was Daniel Yoon, Adrian's business partner, whose appointment to the board 6 months ago had been framed as a modernization initiative. And one was Raymond Tisch. He's on the board, Lena said. He has been for 3 years. I approved it. Marcus's jaw was tight. At the time, I thought proximity to the governance structure would give him accountability. What it gave him was a vote. So when Adrian calls for the challenge, he has Tisch's vote guaranteed. He has Yoon's vote. The financial representative will follow whoever looks like they're winning. That's 4 out of 9, potentially 5 if he can flip one of the legacy directors. Which legacy director is the weak point? Marcus was quiet for a moment. Howard Kessler, he said. He's 71. He wants to retire, but he doesn't want to lose the board stipend while the transition is negotiated. Adrian has been courting him for 8 months' dinners, deference, the performance of a respectful heir apparent.
Is Kessler corrupt?
No. He's tired. Tired men make decisions based on which path has the least friction. Lena wrote the name down. What would change his calculation? Evidence that Adrian's path has more friction than mine, which is exactly what the financial records provide. If we can get them authenticated in front of the board before Adrian moves. Marcus looked at her. He's going to move fast now. Last night changed his timeline. She understood what he meant. Walking out of the engagement party, the ring left on the crate that wasn't just a personal rupture. In Adrian's calculation, Lena now represented a loose variable. Someone with access to his world who was no longer inside his control. How long do we have? She said days. Not weeks. She capped her pen. Then we can't wait for a full forensic audit. We need enough authenticated documentation to call the emergency session ourselves. Marcus looked at her steadily. That requires a petition from board members holding at least 30% of voting weight, which you have. You control your own vote, and the trust structure gives you weighted influence over the 2 longest-standing legacy appointments. She looked at her notes. 3 votes. That's enough to trigger the process. It starts a clock, he said. The moment the petition is filed, Adrian will know. Adrian already knows something is wrong. The question isn't whether he'll respond. The question is whether we're positioned before he moves or after. A silence settled between them. Outside the diner window, the city was fully awake now, traffic building. A delivery truck double-parked, 2 people arguing over a cab at the corner with the resigned energy of people who had been doing this specific argument their whole lives. I need 48 hours, Lena said. My attorney, a forensic accountant I trust, and access to your original transaction logs through a clean channel that Tisch can't monitor. I can give you all of that, Marcus said. And I need you to understand that if this goes sideways, if the board challenge happens before we're ready, if Tisch moves first, if Adrian goes to the press with the version of events where I'm the gold digger who seduced his father for access to the company, I will not soften my testimony to protect your reputation or his. I'm not asking you to. I want to hear you say it clearly. He met her eyes without flinching. If this goes sideways and you're standing in front of federal investigators, you tell them everything you know, including everything I've told you, and you protect yourself first. I'm not asking for your loyalty. I haven't earned it. She studied him for a moment. Then she picked up her legal pad. 48 hours, she said. She didn't go home first. She went directly to the Heart Compliance Solutions office, arriving before her staff, letting herself in with her key, and standing for a moment in the dark entrance before turning on the lights. The office was a converted floor of a building in the financial district open plan, 6 workstations, a conference room with a glass wall, her own office in the back corner that she'd furnished herself over 8 years with things she actually liked rather than things that looked appropriately successful. She stood in her office and looked at it. The diplomas on the wall, the framed photograph from the firm's 5th anniversary, everyone crowded into the frame, Priya laughing at something off camera. The filing cabinet in the corner that held in physical form the original engagement letters for every client Heart Compliance Solutions had ever served, because Lena kept physical backups of everything, had done so since the beginning, a habit from her first job where a system failure had wiped 3 months of documentation, and she'd watched her supervisor age 10 years in an afternoon. Those physical records were going to matter. She pulled on gloves, not because she'd watched enough crime dramas to think fingerprints were the relevant concern, but because she was meticulous, and this was her firm, and she was going to handle what came next the way she handled everything, carefully, methodically, without drama. She pulled the engagement letter files for the past 18 months. She was still working when Priya arrived at 8:15 and stopped dead in the doorway. "You're here," Priya said. "I'm here. You were at your engagement party last night." "I was." Priya came fully into the room and closed the door behind her. She was 26, second-generation Indian American, had an accounting degree and a master's in financial forensics, and the specific sharpness of someone who had grown up watching adults navigate complicated systems and had decided early that she was going to understand how those systems actually work. She had been with Lena for 3 years, and she was, without question, the best professional decision Lena had made in the past decade. She looked at the files spread across Lena's desk. She looked at Lena. "How bad?" she said. "Manageable," Lena said. "But I need you fully in." "Always," Priya said. "And then is the engagement." "Over, yes." A pause. "Do you need a minute?" "I've had several," Lena said. "I need a forensic review." "Get your laptop." By 11 a.m., they had identified 7 document anomalies. By noon, Gerald Marsh had arrived with a forensic accountant named Calvin Reese, who was 60, methodical to the point of making other people nervous, and had spent 20 years as an IRS investigator before deciding that the private sector was more interesting. He sat down with Priya's findings and the USB drive contents and worked without speaking for the better part of 2 hours. The office had gone quiet in the particular way that offices go quiet, when everyone can feel that something serious is happening, but no one has been told what it is yet. Lena had called a brief all-hands in the conference room at 9 and said that there was an administrative matter under review, that client work should continue normally, and that she would address the team fully by end of day. 11 people had looked back at her with varying degrees of concern in the professional discipline not to ask questions in a group setting. She appreciated that about them. At 12:40, Calvin Reese came to her office door. The fabricated documents were generated from a template that partially matches your firm's formatting systems, he said, without preamble. But the metadata shows they were created on a system running a different version of the document software than anything currently registered to Hart Compliance Solutions. Date stamps on 3 of the authorization records were altered after initial creation. The alteration is detectable through the file's version history, which wasn't purged cleanly. Meaning whoever built these documents was competent but not expert. They understood your firm's visual formatting. They didn't understand the forensic trail in the file architecture. Can you document all of that in a form that would be admissible in a federal proceeding? That's what I do, Calvin said. How long? 24 hours for a preliminary report. 72 for the full evidentiary package. I need the preliminary in 12. He looked at her. I'll pay overtime, she said. It's not about overtime, she said. It's about accuracy. 12 hours for a preliminary means it'll be tight. Tight means I flag everything I'm not certain about, which means the preliminary has gaps. Gaps are fine. Gaps can be filled. What I need in 12 hours is enough to show that the fabrication exists and is detectable. The gaps get filled in the 72-hour version. Calvin considered this for exactly the amount of time a careful man considers things. 12 hours, he said. But I'm the one who decides what makes the cut. Agreed. He went back to Priya's workstation. Lena looked at Gerald, who was standing in the corner of her office with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man running probability assessments. The board petition, she said quietly. Marcus needs to file it today, Gerald said, not tomorrow. If Adrian's moving, we can't be in the 48-hour window when the petition lands. I know. He's going to try to discredit you publicly before the board session. That's the move. If he can establish the narrative jilted fiancé, angry woman, fabricated accusations before the evidence is authenticated, it poisons the well. He already told people I left him, Lena said. Gerald nodded. I got a call from a journalist at a financial publication this morning. Phishing. Asking about Vail Consolidated's recent partnership structures and whether Hart Compliance Solutions had any involvement in their subsidiary accounts. Lena felt her jaw tighten. Adrian's already feeding the story. The version where you initiated the financial relationship and tried to leverage the engagement. She was quiet for a moment. The anger was clean and cold, not hot, the kind of anger that doesn't waste itself on expression. Let him, she said. Gerald raised an eyebrow. He's moving in the open now. That means he's scared and he's moving too fast. She looked at Gerald. A man who has the advantage doesn't start feeding stories to financial journalists the morning after his engagement falls apart. He waits. He controls the reveal. Adrian's not controlling anything right now, he's reacting. That makes him more dangerous in some ways, Gerald said, and less effective in others. She picked up her phone. I need to call Marcus. The call lasted 11 minutes. Marcus had been awake since 5. He had already spoken to his personal attorney. He had already initiated the preliminary process for the board petition, which required the signatures of the co-petitioning directors, two men in their late 60s who had known Marcus since the company's early years and who, upon being told in direct terms what the financial records showed, had gone very quiet and then said yes. The petition gets filed at 3 p.m. today, Marcus said. That starts the mandatory 5-day notice period before the emergency session. 5 days, Lena said. It can't be shortened. Then Adrian has 5 days to work Kessler, discredit the evidence, and build a counter-narrative. Yes, she thought for a moment. How public is the petition filing? It goes to the board's secretary and is disclosed to all directors simultaneously. There's no mechanism to keep it private. So Adrian will know by 3:15, probably 3:10. She pressed her fingers briefly to the bridge of her nose. Okay, file it. There's something else, Marcus said. His voice shifted in a way she'd already learned to recognize, not softer, exactly, but more controlled, in the way that people get controlled when they're about to say something they'd rather not. Tell me, she said. Last night, after I left you, I went back to the hotel. I needed to see Adrian. She waited. He knew I was there. He'd seen me arrive on the security footage before he came to find you in the hallway. He'd made a phone call during the party to Raymond Tisch, and the conversation was about accelerating the timeline. You have that call? My security team monitors calls made from the hotel's internal network when I'm present. A standard protocol I put in place years ago. Adrian knows about it and made the call anyway. A pause, which tells you how confident he was that the party was going to end the way he planned it. He thought I'd stay, Lena said. He thought you'd be too invested to walk. The silence had a specific texture to it, the kind that comes from a truth that's not painful so much as clarifying. What did the call to Tisch say? That the timeline was being accelerated. That certain documentation needed to be finalized, his word before the end of the week. And that Tisch should handle the heart situation. Marcus's voice was flat and careful. That phrase specifically. I want you to know that I'm telling you this exactly as recorded, not interpreted. Handle the heart situation, she repeated. Yes. She looked out through her office's glass wall at Priya and Calvin working at adjacent stations, at Gerald making notes in his cramped handwriting, at the photograph of her firm's 5th anniversary on the wall behind her desk. What's your read on what that means? She said. Several possibilities, Marcus said. None of them are good. Give me the worst one. The worst one is that Tisch has already made contact with someone who can create a more severe evidentiary problem for your firm. Something that goes beyond the document fabrication we've already identified. She was very still. Something planted, she said. It's a possibility. I don't have confirmation. But it would explain the timing. If Tisch finalizes whatever documentation he's building this week, and then a more serious fraud allegation lands on heart-compliant solutions before our evidence is authenticated. You're the story, Marcus said, not the board challenge. Not the fun movement. She sat with that for 3 seconds exactly. Marcus, she said, yes. Does your building have physical security that monitors the server room? 24 hours. Biometric access? Continuous surveillance. And your original transaction records the unaltered versions. Where are they physically stored? Encrypted servers in a secured facility in New Jersey. Off-site from all Vail consolidated operations. Accessible only through protocols I personally control. Then we need copies of those records in our attorney's custody before the end of today. Not tomorrow, today. Before Adrian or Tisch can get to them. Already arranged, Marcus said. The transfer happened 40 minutes ago. She exhaled once. Good, Lena, his voice was careful. The board session is 5 days away. During those 5 days, there will be considerable pressure on you. From Adrian, possibly from Tisch, certainly from the press. I know, I want to be straightforward about something. If at any point you want to step back, resolve this through a private settlement, remove your name from the investigation, take a path that protects your firm without the public exposure. Stop, she said. He stopped. I'm not interested in the quiet path, she said. My name is on documents I didn't sign. My firm was used without my knowledge. And the man who was planning to marry me spent months engineering a scheme designed so that if it fell apart, I'd be the person left holding it. Her voice was even. No heat in it. I'm not stepping back. All right, Marcus said. File the petition, she said. I'll be in touch. The petition was filed at 3:02 p.m. By 3:20, Lena's phone was ringing with a number she recognized. She let it ring 4 times, then answered. Adrian, she said. We need to talk. His voice was the voice she'd heard 1,000 times, the professional register, smooth and unhurried, the voice of a man who believed that control of tone was control of outcome. "We really don't," she said. "You've made a serious mistake." "Tell me which one." "I've been making so many lately." A pause. The smoothness didn't crack, but she heard the pressure behind it, the specific strain of a man working hard to maintain a performance. "You don't understand what you've walked into," he said. "My father is not the man you think he is. Whatever he's told you, whatever version of this situation he's presented, it has been constructed specifically to use you." "To use me," she said. "He needs a credible witness. Someone with no prior relationship to the company who can authenticate documents and make it look like an outside verification. He found you in a parking lot the night you were already angry at me, and he told you exactly what you needed to hear." She was quiet for a moment. "That's actually a coherent argument," she said. Another pause, shorter this time, less controlled. He hadn't expected agreement. "It's the truth," he said. "Or," she said, "it's the argument you prepared for this phone call, because you knew I was logical enough to consider it, and you hoped that by presenting it calmly, as though you were concerned for me rather than terrified of the board petition, I might second-guess myself long enough for you to get in front of Kessler." Silence. "Don't call Kessler," she said. "Don't call any of the board members. Don't send anyone to my office. Don't contact my staff, and don't contact me again without going through Gerald Marsh." A pause. And Adrian. "The ring is probably still on the champagne crate. You should get it before the catering company does." She ended the call. Her hand was steady. She was mildly surprised by that, and then not. The press piece came out at 6:47 p.m. It wasn't the financial publication Gerald had been contacted by. It was a business gossip column, the kind of outlet that operated in the exact territory between legitimate reporting and strategic narrative placement, the place where powerful people went to tell their version of a story without their fingerprints on it. The piece was 300 words. It described the abrupt end of the high-profile engagement between Adrian Vail, heir to the Vail consolidated empire, and Lena Hart, whose financial compliance firm had reportedly been involved in recent advisory relationships with Vail subsidiary accounts. It quoted an unnamed source describing Lena as having left the engagement party after a dispute over business arrangements, and noting that Marcus Vail, Adrian's estranged father, had been seen with Lena in a diner the morning after. The final line, deployed with the particular precision of someone who understood that implications land harder than accusations, noted that the emergency board petition filed that afternoon coincidentally named Marcus Vail as the primary petitioner. Lena read it once. Then she set her phone face down on her desk. Priya appeared in her doorway. "I saw it. Everyone saw it," Lena said. "It's garbage. Anyone who actually reads it will see it's garbage. Everyone who matters will read it, and some of them won't look further." She stood up and rolled her shoulders once. "It's fine, it's early. This is the opening move, not the end game." "Are you actually fine?" Priya said. "Not professionally." "Actually," Lena thought about it. "I'm angry," she said, "which means I'm clear." So yes. The next morning brought three things simultaneously. The first was Calvin Reese's preliminary forensic report, delivered at 7 a.m., which confirmed in documented form what Lena had found on her first pass. The fabricated documents were not created on any system registered to Hart-compliant solutions. The version history showed post-creation alterations, and the authorization signatures, while visually accurate, failed a digital authentication check against Lena's actual cryptographic signing credentials. The second was a call from Howard Kessler to Marcus Vail, which Marcus relayed to Lena in a text message that read, "Kessler wants a private meeting. He says he has information about the scheme that he hasn't shared with anyone. He sounds frightened." The third was a hand-delivered letter to the Hart Compliant Solutions office address, no return address, which Priya brought to Lena unopened because she'd recognized the envelope type, the kind of thick cream stock that law firms used for formal correspondence. Inside was a single page. It was a notification from the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. Hart Compliant Solutions was under formal investigation for potential participation in securities fraud. The notification referenced specific account numbers, specific transaction dates, and a series of authorization records that, on their face, showed Lena Hart directing fund movements through Vail subsidiary accounts totaling $4.3 million over 14 months. The documents referenced were not the ones they'd already found and identified as fabricated. They were new. Lena stood in her office holding the letter and felt the particular silence of someone who has just understood that the war moved to a new front while they were defending the original position. Tish had built a second set. He'd had them ready. He'd been waiting for exactly this moment for the board petition to be filed, for Lena to be publicly visible, for the narrative to be established enough that a regulatory investigation would land with maximum damage. And he'd filed it the same day the petition went in. Gerald was in her office within the hour. He read the letter twice. Set it down. This is the move Tish prepared, he said. Obviously, the accounts referenced are different from the ones we've already documented. He's got a separate layer. He anticipated we'd find the first layer, Lena said. He built the second layer as the backup. The one we'd find after we thought we were already done. Gerald looked at her. Lena, a formal FINRA investigation creates a problem for the board session. If it's public before the hearing, it will be, she said. That's the point. He wants it public before the session so that when we walk into that room, I'm a named subject in an active investigation, which means anything I authenticate is challenged as self-serving, which means the evidence we've been building loses its clean witness. Yes. She sat down. For the first time since the engagement party, she felt the weight of it. Not fear, not grief. The specific heaviness of someone who has run the calculation and arrived at a number that is harder than the ones before it. She'd known they were in a fight. She hadn't fully accounted for how much Tish had prepared for exactly this version of the fight. She looked at Gerald. Can we challenge the FINRA filing? We can respond. The preliminary findings take 30 days to formalize. If we can get a full forensic authentication of both documents sets the original fabrications, and this new layer in front of the FINRA examiner before the preliminary period closes, we have grounds to challenge the evidentiary basis of the investigation. 30 days. The board session is in 5, I know. The investigation will be public by tomorrow morning, which means it lands in the press the same day the board members are reading their session briefs. Yes, she was very still. Kessler's meeting with Marcus, she said suddenly. Gerald frowned. What about it? Kessler reached out because he's frightened. Why is he frightened? She looked at Gerald. He's not frightened of us. We filed the petition. We're the challenge. Kessler should be managing us, not running to Marcus. Gerald was quiet for a moment. He's frightened of Tish, she said. Gerald picked up his phone. Call Marcus, she said. Tell him the Kessler meeting needs to happen today. Not tomorrow, this afternoon. Why the urgency specifically? Because Kessler knows something about Tish that goes beyond what's in the financial records. Something that scared him badly enough to reach out the same day the petition was filed. She stood up, and if Tish finds out that Kessler is talking to Marcus, that meeting doesn't happen. The meeting happened at 4 p.m. in the private room at a members club that Marcus maintained on Cantinsa Resinton, at the kind of room where conversations disappeared into the woodwork the way they were designed to, where the staff understood that the correct response to anything overheard was permanent amnesia. Lena was not invited to the meeting. She sat in the car outside for 40 minutes, working through Calvin's preliminary report and building a response framework for the FINRA notification with Priya on speakerphone. She'd learned a long time ago that the most productive thing she could do with helplessness was refuse to feel it. And the most effective way to refuse it was to work. When Marcus came out, he walked directly to the car and got in the back seat beside her. He looked like a man who had just been told something he'd been afraid to confirm. Howard Kessler has been receiving payments, Marcus said. Lena turned to look at him. Not large amounts. Not the kind that would show up, obviously. A consulting stipend, paid through a Tish-controlled entity, structured as a board advisory fee. Has been happening for 22 months. Tish has been paying Kessler for 2 years, which means Kessler isn't an undecided vote. He's been Tish's vote the whole time. Then why is he coming to you now? Marcus exhaled. Because 2 weeks ago, Tish told him the plan was changing. Originally, the intention was to use the board challenge to transfer operational control to Adrian, with Tish as the permanent COO. That's what Kessler signed on, for he thought he was backing the winner, collecting his fee, and retiring in 18 months with a comfortable exit. But the plan changed, Lena said. Tish told Kessler that Adrian was becoming a liability, that the new structure would bypass Adrian entirely, that Tish intended to position himself as the transitional CEO in the aftermath of the board challenge, on the grounds that Marcus and Adrian were both compromised. She stared at him. Tish was never working for Adrian, she said. No, he was working for himself. Adrian was the mechanism, the leverage to remove you, and once you were out, Tish intended to remove Adrian too. Yes. And Kessler panicked because he realized he wasn't a participant in a controlled transition. He was a paid accomplice in a conspiracy whose final stage didn't include him. He wanted to give us enough to protect himself, Marcus said. He's not interested in justice. He's interested in survival. Lena looked out the window at the street. The city going about its business in the particular way it always did, impervious, continuous, entirely uninterested in the specific devastation happening inside a specific car at a specific corner. Tish built the FINRA filing, she said. He built the second document set. He filed the investigation today, the same day the petition went in, which means he had it ready and was waiting for the trigger. Yes, which means he's moving now, not in 5 days. Now, Marcus said nothing. He wants the board session to happen in chaos, she said. He wants Marcus' credibility damaged, Lena under investigation, Adrian isolated and controllable, and Kessler locked in by his own complicity. That's what Kessler described, Marcus said quietly. She turned to look at him. His face in the late afternoon light through the car window was not the face of a man who was afraid. It was the face of a man who was angry in the specific banked way of someone who has been patient for a very long time and is now done being patient. Does Kessler have documentation? She said. The payments, the communications with Tish, any of it? He has 18 months of payment records and 4 emails. Will he give them to us? He wants immunity from any board-level consequences. No public disclosure of his involvement. A clean exit. We can't promise him immunity from a federal investigation. I know. I told him that. Marcus paused. He said he'd give us the documents anyway. I think he's more frightened of Tish than he is of the investigators. She sat with that for a moment. We can use Kessler's records to establish that Tish had a corrupted board vote from the beginning, she said. That changes the framing of the entire scheme. This isn't an heir apparent challenging a founder. This is a COO who spent 2 years building a shadow structure inside a company he intended to take for himself, using the founder's son as a disposable tool and a compliance consultant's name as cover. Yes, the FINRA filing doesn't go away. But if we can get Kessler's records into Gerald's hands tonight and connect them to Calvin's forensic report. We change the story before the press picks up the FINRA investigation, Marcus said. We give them a different story to pick up, she said. A bigger one. Marcus looked at her. The car was quiet. Outside, a bus went past, and then a man on a bicycle, and then the ordinary city in the ordinary evening. There's a risk, he said. There's always a risk. If we push this tonight, if we give the documents to the press and go on record before the board session, Tish will know Kessler turned. He'll move to destroy whatever leverage he has left, which means he'll move against Adrian, she said. Marcus was quiet. Your son, she said carefully. Whatever Adrian has done, Tish is the plan to throw him to the federal authorities as the primary architect of the whole scheme. Those second-layer documents that Tish filed with FINRA, I'd bet that version of the record shows Adrian directing the fund movements, not Tish. Adrian authorized things he didn't fully understand, Marcus said. That's not an excuse. But Tish made sure Adrian's name was on the instruments and kept his own name off them. Then Adrian is the one who needs to understand what's coming for him. Marcus looked at her sharply. Not to protect him, she said, because the most dangerous person in the next 24 hours is a man who thinks he's running a plan that has already been dismantled under him without his knowledge. She met Marcus's eyes. Adrian needs to know what Tish actually built, not from you, from us, with the records in front of him. You want to confront my son. I want to show your son the evidence. What he does with it is his choice. She paused. But if we don't, and Tish gets to him first with a version that positions Adrian as a loyal soldier who was betrayed by his father, he'll fight the board session as a united front with Tish. And we lose. Marcus was very still. You've thought about this longer than the last 5 minutes, he said. Since the diner this morning, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face, not approval, exactly, but the recognition a man has when someone has calculated a step he hadn't yet reached. I'll set up the meeting, he said. Tonight, she said. Tonight, she reached for the door handle, then stopped. Marcus. She didn't look at him. When we sit down with Adrian, he's going to say things. About you, about the kind of father you were, about why he did what he did. A pause. You need to be prepared for that, not to break your focus. Silence. I've been preparing for that conversation for 20 years, Marcus said quietly. She got out of the car. The evening air was cold and sharp and completely indifferent to everything that was about to happen, and she stood on the sidewalk for exactly 3 seconds before she took out her phone and called Gerald Marsh and said, "We're moving tonight. This is a work of complete fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, organizations, events, and locations are entirely invented." Part 3, the meeting with Adrian, was set for 9 p.m. Marcus owned a private floor in a building 12 blocks from Vail Consolidated's headquarters, not an apartment, not an office, but something in between a space he'd maintained for 20 years for the kind of conversations that couldn't happen in either of those places. A boardroom table that seated 6. A wet bar no one had touched in months. Windows that looked out over the city at an angle that made everything below look smaller than it was. Lena arrived first. She wanted the room before anyone else was in it. She walked the perimeter once, out of habit, checked the sight lines, set her materials at the chair that put her back to the wall and gave her a clear view of both the door and Marcus's face simultaneously. Calvin's preliminary report was printed and tabbed. Kessler's payment records, which Gerald had collected and authenticated in a 3-hour sprint that had aged the attorney visibly, were organized by date. The USB drive contents the original 14 months of transaction records were loaded on her laptop and ready to navigate. She sat down and drank water and waited. Marcus arrived at 8:50. He looked at her setup and didn't comment. He poured himself something from the bar, not much, 2 fingers of something dark, and stood at the window for a moment with his back to the room. "He knows it's both of us," Marcus said. "Good," she said. "He'll read it as an ambush." "It is an ambush." She looked at her materials. "The only way this conversation works is if he understands immediately that we have everything. Not some of it. Everything. If he thinks there's a gap he can maneuver through, he'll maneuver." Marcus turned from the window. "And if he shuts down entirely, then we show him Tish's version of the records. The ones that put all of it on Adrian." She met his eyes. "That usually ends the shutdown." A key turned in the door. Adrian Vale walked in looking like a man who had decided on his way up in the elevator that he was going to be reasonable, and the decision was costing him enormously. He was dressed well, not formally, but intentionally. Dark jacket, open collar, the studied casualness of someone who had learned early that appearing not to try was its own form of power. He looked at his father first briefly, then at Lena. The expression that crossed his face when he saw her sitting at that table with those materials in front of her was not anger. Not yet. It was the specific look of a man recalculating. "Sit down, Adrian," Marcus said. "I'll stand," Adrian said. "Sit down," Marcus said again. Same tone, no escalation. The voice of a man who had decided that this conversation was going to be conducted on his terms regardless of what happened. Adrian sat. He looked at Lena. "You don't have to be here." "I do, actually," she said. "My name is on your documents. That makes this my room as much as yours. Those documents were fabricated by Raymond Tish using metadata from your firm's servers, altered after creation and signed with a digital signature that fails cryptographic authentication against my actual credentials." She slid Calvin's report across the table. "Preliminary forensic findings. The full evidentiary package is in preparation." Adrian looked at the report. Didn't pick it up. "I know about the fabrication," he said. The room went very still. Lena kept her face neutral through an act of pure professional will. "Say that again," she said. "I knew the documents weren't clean." His jaw was tight, the muscle below his left ear working. "I didn't know he was using your signature specifically." "When I found out? When did you find out?" Marcus said. Adrian's eyes moved to his father. Something, not warmth, not even the ghost of it, but the specific loaded weight of 2 people who share history they've never fully spoken about and are now being forced to inhabit it in front of a witness. 3 weeks ago, Adrian said. 3 weeks ago, Lena repeated. "And you said nothing." "I told Tish to clean it up." "You told Tish to clean it up," she said. Her voice was even. Flat. The voice she used when she was most furious and most controlled, which were always the same moment for her. "You discovered that your COO had forged documents using my company's name, and your response was to ask him to clean it up. I was managing the situation. You were protecting the scheme," she said. "Because telling me or going to the authorities would have exposed everything. So you told the man who built the problem to fix the problem, which is exactly what a man does when he's more invested in the outcome than in the person who got hurt." Adrian's composure was starting to fray at the edges. Not dramatically, he was too trained for that, but she could see it in the slight forward cant of his shoulders, the way his right hand had moved from the table to his thigh. "You don't understand the position I was in," he said. "You used that exact sentence on me 2 nights ago," Lena said, "in a service corridor. It didn't work then either." Marcus set his glass down on the windowsill and came to the table. He didn't sit. He stood at the head, both hands flat on the surface, and he looked at his son with an expression that Lena recognized as the final version of something, the face of a decision that had been building for a long time and had finally arrived. "I'm going to show you something," Marcus said, "and you're going to look at it." He opened his own folder and slid 3 pages across the table. Adrian looked down. The pages were financial records, but not the ones from the USB drive. not the ones Lena had been working with. These were formatted differently, the header structure of a different internal system, and the account designations were Veil Consolidated's primary accounts rather than the subsidiary web. These came to my attorney this morning, Marcus said, from a source inside the company. Adrian's eyes moved across the pages. She watched his face change. It happened in stages: the initial scan, the recognition, and then something she hadn't expected. Not shock. Something that looked almost like transformation. The look of a man who has been afraid of something for weeks and has just seen it materialize. "This isn't my structure," Adrian said. His voice had changed. The controlled smoothness was gone. "These account numbers, I've never touched these accounts." "No," Marcus said. "You haven't." "Then why is my name on the authorization lines?" "Because," Marcus said, "Raymond Tisch has been building a version of the records where you are the primary architect, and he is the implementing officer operating under executive direction." Adrian stared at the pages. "He's setting me up," he said. "He set you up 14 months ago," Lena said. "You just didn't know it." The silence that followed was the longest in the room. Adrian sat very still in his chair. Not the stillness of a man processing, the stillness of a man who has been hit and hasn't yet decided whether to fall. Lena watched him carefully. She'd thought about this moment in the car with Marcus, had turned it over and tried to predict the shape of it, but she'd gotten the shape wrong. She'd expected anger at Tisch, at Marcus, possibly at her. What she saw instead was something she recognized from her own experience 2 nights ago in a hotel service corridor. The specific devastation of a person who has just understood that they were less trusted than they thought. Adrian had believed he and Tisch were partners. He was learning that Tisch had been building a cage around him for over a year, carefully, methodically, with the patience of someone who understood that the best trap is one the subject helps construct. "How far does it go?" Adrian said. His voice was low. "Not a performance now." "FINRA received a filing yesterday," Lena said, "based on a document set we hadn't seen. The filing puts $4.3 million in fraudulent fund movements under your authorization." "I didn't authorize 4.3. "I know," she said. "The records are fabricated, the same way the records using my company's name were fabricated. Tisch built 2 sets, one to use my firm as cover, one to put everything traceable on you." Adrian looked at his father. "You knew." "I knew Tisch was preparing something. I didn't know the full scope until Kessler came to me yesterday." "Kessler." Something moved in Adrian's face. "How long has Kessler been?" 22 months, Lena said. Adrian closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, then opened them. "He was supposed to be our vote." "He was Tisch's vote," she said. "You were Tisch's mechanism. The board challenge, the fund movement, the pressure on your father's position, all of it served Tisch's purpose, not yours. When you were useful, you were a partner. When the plan reached its final stage, you were the evidence." Adrian put both hands on the table flat the way Marcus had. It was unconscious, the gesture of a man trying to anchor himself to a physical surface because the conceptual ground had dropped out entirely. "What does he get?" Adrian said. "If this works, what does Tisch actually get?" "The company," Marcus said simply. "Transitional CEO in the aftermath of the board challenge. Both of us discredited or removed. Clean hands because every instrument was signed by you or by a forged compliance entity." Adrian said nothing for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was different from anything she'd heard from him before. Not the smooth professional register, not the managed anger. Something rawer and less constructed. "I thought it was about proving something to you," he said to Marcus. "That was the part Tisch understood. He knew that everything I wanted was about you, about the company, about the position, about being seen as capable of running what you built. And he used it." A pause. "I handed him the lever myself." Marcus didn't respond immediately. Lena watched him, the tight line of his jaw, the slight movement in his throat. "Yes," Marcus said finally. "He did." "That's not an absolution," Adrian said sharply. "I know it's not. You were a bad father. I'm not recanting that because Tisch turned out to be worse. I'm not asking you to." The 2 men looked at each other across the length of the table, and Lena sat between them, watching, and had the specific feeling of someone in the presence of a conversation that had been waiting 20 years for a room to happen in. She let it breathe for 10 seconds. Then she said, "We don't have time for the full version of this tonight." Both men looked at her. "The board session is in 4 days. Tisch knows Kessler came to Marcus, he'll find out, if he hasn't already. The FINRA filing is going to be public by tomorrow morning, and it will name both your company and Adrian." She looked at Adrian directly, "which means in approximately 12 hours, you are a named subject in a federal investigation. The press will have it by noon." Adrian's color had shifted. Not pale, a specific grayish quality that came from the kind of stress the body registers before the mind has fully caught up. What do you need from me, he said. The original documentation, she said. Your actual records, the real account authorizations, the real communication chain, everything that shows the difference between what you actually directed and what Tish says you directed. If I give you that, you're cooperating with an investigation that may still result in consequences for you, she said. I'm not going to tell you it won't. What you directed, what you authorized, what you participated in knowingly, that's a legal matter. And I'm not your attorney. Then why would I? Because the alternative, she said, is Tish's version becomes the record. Your name on $4.3 million of fraudulent fund movement, no counter evidence, no cooperation, and a COO who has 11 years of institutional knowledge to use against you. She held his gaze. I've seen what federal exposure looks like for someone with no documentation on their side. You don't walk away from that version. Adrian looked at his father again. Marcus said nothing. Lena had asked him, in the car, not to push Adrian in this room. She'd said if you advocate for the choice, he'll resist it to resist you. He has to make it without you asking. Marcus held his silence. Adrian looked back at Lena. There's a secure server, he said. Personal. Not connected to Vail Consolidated Systems. I set it up 8 months ago when I started to feel like something was wrong. I couldn't name it, but something in how Tish managed the documentation felt off. I started keeping my own copies. Lena kept very still. You've been building a record, she said. I've been covering myself, Adrian said. Yes, that's all it was. I wasn't thinking about cooperation or evidence or any of this. Something felt wrong and I kept copies. Where is the server? He named a location. A data facility in a different state, accessible through credentials only he held. Can you access it tonight, she said. Yes. And that's what happens next. Adrian left the room at 10:40 to make the necessary arrangements, stepping out to call his personal attorney at Lena's insistence, because she was not letting him hand over anything without his own legal counsel present. Marcus and Lena were alone in the room. He stood at the window again. She remained at the table, not pretending to work, just sitting with the specific fatigue of someone who had run at high intensity for 36 hours and was feeling the accumulated weight. You believed him, Marcus said. Not a question. About the server? Yes, she said. About everything else partially. Which parts do you believe? I believe he didn't fully understand Tish's endgame. I believe the thing about keeping his own copies, because a man who fully trusted his co-conspirator doesn't build a private backup. She paused. I don't believe he didn't know the documents using my firm's name were problematic. I think he knew, and he made a calculated decision that the risk to me was acceptable collateral. Marcus was quiet. That doesn't make him a monster, she said. It makes him a person who decided someone else's exposure was worth his convenience, which is a thing people do, especially when the person is in a position where they can tell themselves she'll be fine, she's smart, she'll land on her feet. He was going to marry you, Marcus said. He was going to marry the version of me that was useful to his plan, she said. I don't think he ever saw the full person. The words sat in the room. She hadn't meant them as anything other than analysis. But she heard them land and recognized that they cost something to say. Marcus turned from the window. He looked at her with that particular directness. He had the look of a man who had learned somewhere along the way that the most respectful thing you could do for another person was to actually see them. For what it's worth, he said. Don't, she said quietly. He stopped. Whatever you're about to say, don't say it tonight. Not in this room. Not while we're in the middle of this. She looked at him steadily. We have 4 days and a collapsing situation, and I need to stay clear. Okay? A pause. Okay, he said. Adrian's attorney arrived at 11:15. A woman named Constance Park, 50s, former federal prosecutor, the kind of attorney you hired when you were serious about surviving something. She reviewed the situation with the compressed efficiency of someone accustomed to being called at unusual hours with complex problems, asked 7 precise questions, and then nodded once. We'll have secure access to the server established by 6 a.m., she said. I need a copy in my attorney's possession by 8, Lena said. Gerald Marsh, Constance said. You know him? We were in the same DOJ division for 3 years. A slight, dry expression. He's thorough. Then you understand why 8 a.m. isn't negotiable. Understood. Adrian sat through this exchange without speaking. He was watching Lena in the way someone watches a person they've drastically miscalculated, not with admiration, not with resentment, but with the specific unsettled look of a man who has been forced to revise an assumption he didn't know he was making. He thought she would break. Not crumble, he wasn't that foolish. But bend. Seek a quiet exit. Do what most people do when the situation exceeds what they signed up for. She hadn't bent at all. She got up from the table at 11:30 and collected her materials. Adrian, she said. He looked at her. Tish is going to find out about tonight. Probably tomorrow morning, possibly sooner. When he does, he's going to move against whatever loose ends he thinks exist. She held his gaze. You are the largest loose end. Something went through his face. Not fear, she didn't think fear was the right word for it. Recognition, I know, he said. Don't be reachable tonight. Not to anyone connected to the company. Not even people you trust. She paused. Especially people you trust. She picked up her bag and walked out. She slept 4 hours. Not well fitful, surface-level sleep, the kind where you're aware of the ceiling above you and the specific quality of the dark. But 4 hours was what was available, and she was practical about what was available. Her phone woke her at 5:47 a.m. Not her alarm. An incoming call. The number was not one she recognized. She almost didn't answer. She answered Miss Hart. The voice was male, measured, carrying the specific quality of someone accustomed to being listened to. My name is Raymond Tish. The cold that moved through her was instantaneous and total. She sat up, her feet hit the floor. She was fully alert in the time it takes to exhale. I'm listening, she said. I won't waste your time or mine with pleasantries, he said. I know about last night's meeting. I know Kessler spoke to Marcus, and I know what he gave him. I know you were in that room with Adrian. A pause. I know about the server. Her jaw was tight. She breathed through it. Then you know what we have, she said. I know what you think you have, he said. What you actually have is a partial picture that without me you cannot complete. Make your point. There is a third document set, he said. Not the fabrications using your company's name. Not the second layer records filed with FINRA. A third set, the originals. The actual transaction records as they occurred, without modification, without fabrication, showing exactly who authorized what and when. She was very still. If that set surfaces, Tish said, it resolves everything. Every question about your company's involvement, every question about the FINRA filing, every question about who built what and for whom. A pause. It also shows something else. Something that neither Marcus nor Adrian has told you. And what is that, she said. Her voice came out steady. She was grateful for that. Marcus Vale has known about the fund movements for longer than he told you, Tish said. Not 14 months. 26. The first phase of the scheme, the phase that predates Adrian's involvement, was authorized at the executive level by Marcus himself. The room felt different. You're lying, she said. The words were automatic. The certainty behind them was not quite as automatic. The originals will show you, Tish said. I've been the architect, Miss Hart. But the first architect was Marcus. He built the structure. He used it for his own purposes for 12 months before Adrian found out and took it in a different direction. Another pause. Your partnership with Marcus is built on a story he chose to tell you. I'm offering you the full one. Why, she said. Why would you offer me anything? Because I need a clean witness, Tish said. Someone with no prior relationship to the company, with a legitimate or professional standing, whose authentication of the original records would be unchallengeable. A pause. The same reason Marcus came to you. I'm simply offering you the accurate version of what you'd be authenticating. Her pulse was steady. Her mind was working fast and cold. Where are the originals, she said. That depends on what you're willing to do, Tish said. Tell me where they are, she said, and I'll tell you what I'm willing to do. The federal building, he said. An attorney with DOJ connections submitted them to a federal examiner at 7 p.m. last night. The examiner is reviewing them this morning. A pause. By noon today, those records will be the official basis for a federal investigation that names Marcus Vale as the primary subject. She stared at the wall of her bedroom. You already filed them, she said. Last night, while you were in that room with Marcus and his son, arranging your alliance. She understood then. Tish hadn't called to negotiate. He'd called because he'd already moved. The call was designed to do exactly one thing: land this information in the hours before the federal investigation became public, so that when it did, Lena would already be processing the possibility that Marcus had lied to her. Doubt. He was planting doubt. You're very good at this, she said. I've had time to practice, Tish said. The 26-month claim, she said. You expect me to start pulling at that thread before I've verified anything. You expect me to go to Marcus this morning with a question I can't answer, and that question will fracture the alliance before the board session. Silence on the line. Even if there's a grain of truth in it, she said, you've shaped how I receive it. which means whatever Marcus tells me, I'll hear it through what you said first. That's very analytical for 5:50 in the morning, Tish said. I'm a risk assessor, she said. I understand how contaminated evidence works. A pause. You're going to tell me something true enough to be verifiable, surrounded by enough distortion to make me doubt everything adjacent to it. Or, Tish said, I'm telling you the complete truth, and you're using analytical framing to avoid a conclusion that frightens you. She stepped across to the window. The city was gray in the pre-dawn, the light not yet fully decided. What do you want, she said. Withdraw from the process, he said. Take your firm's cooperation off the table. Let the FINRA investigation proceed without your counterfiling. Step back, protect your company, and let the board session resolve itself without your evidence in the room. And in exchange, the FINRA filing that names Heart Compliant Solutions gets quietly withdrawn. Your firm's name disappears from every document in every proceeding. And Marcus goes to federal investigators without the authentication I can provide. Yes. You need me out of the room, she said. I need the room to contain the people who belong in it, Tish said. This started as a Vale family matter, Miss Hart. You were never supposed to be in it. I was put in it, she said. By the documents your people built using my name. A regrettable miscalculation, he said. She actually laughed. A single short sound, not warm. You used my company as a weapon and you're calling it a miscalculation. I'm offering you an exit, he said. Take it. She looked at the city. She thought about Marcus's face in the diner, in the car, in that room at the window. She thought about the precision of his answers, the specific way he'd never asked her for anything she hadn't already decided to give. She thought about the 26-month figure, which was lodged in her now whether she wanted it or not, sitting exactly where Tish intended it to sit. She thought about what Gerald would say, that the most dangerous moment in any complex proceeding was not the obvious attack. It was the one that made you question your own foundation. I'll need to verify, she said, before I agree to anything. I'll need to see the originals, of course, Tish said. My attorney will contact yours this morning with the access protocol. One more thing, she said. Yes? If the records show what you say they show, if Marcus authorized the first phase, what happens to him? A pause. That's a matter for federal investigators, Tish said. But from where you're standing, from where I'm standing, Tish said, Marcus Vale built the situation himself. What happens to him is the consequence of the choices he made 26 months ago. A pause. The same logic that applies to my choices. And to yours. She said nothing. I'll await your attorney's contact, Tish said. And the line went dead. She stood at the window for a long time. The gray outside was becoming something closer to light. Somewhere down on the street, a delivery truck engine turned over, and a dog barked at the sound and then went quiet. She knew what Tish had done. She knew exactly the mechanism of it, could name every component the early morning call designed to catch her slightly off balance, the verifiable detail embedded in the larger distortion, the offer that looked like an exit and was actually a trap, the doubt planted with surgical precision about the one person whose reliability she'd staked her position on. She knew all of it, and the doubt was there anyway, because the 26-month figure was specific. Not 20 months, not 2 years. 26. That kind of specificity was either a very precise lie or a very specific truth, and she'd spent her entire career learning that the difference between those two things was almost always in the records. She needed to see the records. She picked up her phone and called Marcus. He answered on the second ring. He'd been awake. We need to talk, she said. In person, in the next hour. A pause. What happened, he said. Tish called me. A longer pause. I'll send a car, he said. I'll take my own, she said, and ended the call before he could respond. She stood in her bedroom and looked at her reflection in the dark window glass not clearly, just the shape of herself, indistinct and overlaid on the gray city outside, and she thought, if he lied to me, everything we've built in 3 days collapses. And I have no position that isn't also rubble. She got dressed. She moved carefully, deliberately, the way she always moved when the situation was serious, not rushing, not stalling, just doing the next correct thing in sequence. Clothes, coffee, bag, keys. At the door of her apartment, she stopped. She thought about walking out of the engagement party 3 nights ago. She thought about the ring on the champagne crate. She thought about sitting in a diner with a man she didn't know, drinking bad coffee, and deciding to trust the specific quality of his answers, even when she couldn't yet trust him. She thought, I've been wrong before. And then she thought, so has everyone who ever got anything right. She opened the door and walked into the hallway and took the elevator down to the lobby and stepped out into the cold early morning air and got into her car and she drove toward the conversation that would either confirm everything she'd built in 3 days or detonate it entirely. And she kept her hand steady on the wheel the whole way there. This is a work of complete fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, organizations, events, and locations are entirely invented. Part 4. Marcus was already at the door when she's arrived. Not waiting in the lobby, not sending someone down. At the door himself, in the same dark coat he'd worn the night of the party, which told her he'd either not slept or had been dressed and moving since before her call. His face in the early morning light was stripped of everything performative, no management, no controlled presentation. Just a man who knew what was coming and had decided to meet it standing up. She walked past him into the room without a greeting. She set her bag on the table, turned around. "Tell me about the first phase," she said. He didn't ask what she meant. That alone told her something. "Tish called you," he said. 40 minutes ago. He said the scheme started 26 months ago, not 14. He said the first 12 months were authorized at the executive level. She held his gaze without blinking. He said by Hugh. Marcus walked to the table. He didn't sit. He put both hands flat on the surface, the same way he had the night before, and she recognized it now as the physical thing he did when he was about to say something he'd been carrying for a long time. There was a restructuring, he said, 26 months ago. A legitimate restructuring of subsidiary accounts moving assets between entities to optimize the tax exposure on 3 international contracts. I authorized it. Tish designed the mechanism. And the mechanism Tish designed was structurally identical to what he later used to move funds fraudulently. Same account architecture, same routing logic, same compliance entity structure. Marcus looked at her. I didn't know that when I authorized it. I knew it 6 months later, when I started auditing the derivatives and found the seam. 6 months later, she said. Yes. So for 6 months, your name was on a structure that Tish later used as the template for fraud. Yes, and you didn't disclose that to me. The silence was its own answer. She pulled out a chair and sat down. Not because she needed to. Because she needed to do something with the specific weight in her chest, and sitting was available. Walk me through your reasoning, she said. When you came to me on that sidewalk, when you sat in that diner and told me about the scheme, you made a choice not to include the first phase. Tell me why. Marcus sat down across from her. He didn't look away. Because the first phase was legally authorized, he said. The restructuring was legitimate. Tish repurposed the architecture without my knowledge. My attorneys reviewed it, and the conclusion was that my authorization of the original restructuring did not constitute participation in the fraud. Your attorneys, she said. Yes. So you had a legal opinion that cleared you, and you decided that was sufficient justification to present me with an incomplete picture. I decided, he said carefully, that including information which my own counsel had determined was legally irrelevant would complicate your assessment of the situation, without changing the facts of what Tish and Adrian had built. Or, she said, you decided that telling me you'd authorized the template for the fraud would make me walk away before you had my cooperation. He was quiet. Which is it? She said. Another silence. Longer, both, he said. She looked at him. He held the look without flinching, without managing it, without reaching for any of the smoother versions of this moment that a practiced man could have produced. Both, she repeated. The legal assessment was genuine. And yes, I was afraid that telling you about the first phase would end this before it started. He met her eyes directly. I was wrong to make that calculation. I should have told you everything and let you decide. The room was very quiet. She thought about Tish on the phone. The precision of the 26-month figure. The offer of the original originals. The exit that was actually a trap. Tish filed the original originals with a federal examiner last night, she said. I know. My attorney was notified at 6 a.m. You knew before I called. Yes. And you were going to tell me I was already in my coat, he said. She studied him. The fatigue in his face. The particular quality of his stillness, not the stillness of a man hiding, but the stillness of a man who has stopped moving because there's nowhere left to go that isn't the truth. The original originals, she said. Did they show what Tish says they show? They show the legitimate restructuring that I authorized. And they show the subsequent fraud that Tish built on top of it. He paused. What they do not show, what no record shows, is my authorization of anything beyond the original restructuring. Because I didn't authorize it. But a federal examiner looking at those records this morning. We'll see a continuum, he said. Same architecture, my signature on the first phase, Tish's on the subsequent phases. Without context, without my attorney's analysis, without understanding the seam between the legitimate structure and the fraudulent addition, he stopped. It looks like participation. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. Tish didn't just file those records to expose you, she said. He filed them to give the federal investigation a primary subject before the board session. If investigators are looking at Marcus Vail as the architect of a 26-month fraud scheme, the board session becomes irrelevant. The challenge doesn't matter. The company falls into interim management while the investigation proceeds. And Tish positions himself as the senior operational officer maintaining continuity during the crisis, Marcus said. He wins without the board vote, she said. Yes. She opened her eyes. We have until the board session in 4 days, she said. But that's not the real deadline. The real deadline is how long before the federal investigation becomes the story instead of the board challenge. The examiner review will conclude within 24 to 48 hours, Marcus said. If the preliminary finding goes against me, it becomes public, she said, and everything we've built becomes defense testimony instead of prosecution evidence. She stood up. Her mind was running at the kind of speed that felt almost physical, not frantic, but pressurized, the sensation of someone pushing hard against a closing window. I need to see the originals, she said. Lena, not to verify your story. I believe your story. She looked at him directly. I need to see them because I need to understand the seam, exact point where the legitimate structure ends and the fraud begins. Because that seam is the only thing that separates your authorization from Tish's fraud in a document that, right now, makes them look continuous. Marcus looked at her. If I can identify and document that seam, she said, and get that analysis in front of the federal examiner before the preliminary finding is issued, you interrupt the investigation before it becomes public. I change its direction. She picked up her phone. I need Gerald, and I need Calvin Reese, and I need access to those records within the next 2 hours. The federal examiner won't release them. He doesn't have to release them. Your attorney can request access under your rights as a named party. The examiner can't deny that. She was already dialing. Call your attorney right now. Marcus picked up his phone. The next 4 hours were the kind that collapsed time. Gerald arrived in 30 minutes, Calvin in 45, and they set up in Marcus's private floor with 4 laptops, 2 phones running simultaneously, and the compressed, airless focus of people who understand that the work happening in this room in the next few hours will determine outcomes that no subsequent effort can reverse. The federal examiner's office granted document access at 9:17 a.m. under Marcus's attorney's petition, delivered electronically with a 6-hour review window, meaning the materials had to be returned, and the session closed by 3:15 p.m. No copies, no downloads, screen review only monitored remotely. Calvin sat in front of the monitor. He didn't speak for the first 40 minutes. He moved through the records with the patience of a man who had spent 20 years learning that the answer was always in the document if you looked at the right layer. Lena stood behind him. She'd told Marcus to stay across the room, not because she didn't trust him in this moment, but because she needed Calvin's eyes on the records without the weight of the room's intention affecting what he saw. At 10:03, Calvin said, "There," she leaned in. He was pointing at a record dated 24 months ago, 2 months after the legitimate restructuring Marcus had authorized. A single account transfer. Small, relative to what came later. $80,000 moved from a Vail subsidiary account to a compliance entity. The authorization signature was Marcus's. She looked at it for a long time. That's not part of the original restructuring, Calvin said quietly. The restructuring closed 16 days before this date. This is a separate transaction. Her pulse was very steady. She made it stay that way. Is the signature authentic? She said. That's what I'm looking at. Calvin pulled up a comparison window. He worked for 11 minutes without speaking. Then, the metadata on this authorization record shows it was created 3 weeks ago. She went very still. The transaction date is 24 months ago, she said, but the document was created 3 weeks ago. The transaction itself may have occurred, Calvin said. I can't tell from this record whether the underlying transfer happened. What I can tell you is that this specific authorization document, the one bearing Marcus Vail's signature, was generated recently and backdated. Tish built a third fabrication, she said. Inserted into the originals, Calvin said. One document, placed at the precise point in the timeline that creates the appearance of continuity between Marcus's legitimate authorization and the subsequent fraud. She straightened up. One document. Tish had taken the legitimate restructuring records, which were authentic, and inserted one fabricated authorization at the 2-month mark, just far enough from the original structure to look like a subsequent decision, just close enough to create the appearance of an unbroken chain. It was elegant, It was also, now that Calvin had found it, completely visible. Document everything, she said. Every comparison. Every metadata timestamp. Every discrepancy. I want a written analysis ready in 2 hours. You'll have it, Calvin said. She turned and walked to Marcus. He was standing by the window always, the window, she thought, the specific habit of a man who needed an horizon when the room got heavy. He turned when she approached. She told him what Calvin had found. His jaw went tight. A muscle moved in his face. He breathed once deliberately through his nose. He planted it in the federal record. He said, yes. Which means when the examiner reviews the documents, he's already seen it, she said. The fabricated authorization is sitting in the federal record right now. The examiner read it this morning as part of the originals package. She met his eyes. We have until 3:15 to get Calvin's analysis to the examiner's office. If we can challenge the fabricated document before the preliminary finding is issued, we interrupt the case against me before it's formalized. We eliminate the case against you, she said. Because without that one document, there is no continuity. There's your legitimate restructuring, followed by Tish's fraud, with a clean break between them. Marcus looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face, not relief, not yet, because they weren't there yet, but something close to it. 2 hours, he said. Less than that, she said. Get your attorney on the phone. I need the submission protocol for the examiner's office. Calvin finished at 12:40. The analysis was 19 pages. It was the clearest, most precisely documented forensic accounting work Lena had seen in 15 years of the profession, and she'd seen a great deal of it. The fabricated document's metadata discrepancy was documented 6 different ways, cross-referenced against Calvin's earlier findings on the Hart-compliant solutions fabrications to establish Tish's pattern of document creation and backdating, and accompanied by a technical appendix that explained the methodology in language a non-specialist could follow. Gerald reviewed it in 12 minutes, reading at the speed of a man who has been doing this for 30 years, and this holds. Marcus's attorney submitted it to the federal examiner's office at 1:08 p.m. The 6-hour review window closed at 3:15. The submission arrived 2 hours and 7 minutes before that. And then there was nothing to do but wait. Waiting was its own specific kind of violence. Lena sat at the table and responded to emails from Hart-compliant solutions staff, reviewed the FINRA response framework with Priya over the phone, half of a sandwich Gerald had ordered because her body had started to register that it had not been adequately maintained in 48 hours. Functioning. Operational. But underneath all of it, the specific tight frequency of someone waiting for a door to open or close. At 2:47, Marcus's phone rang. He answered it standing in the middle of the room, and she watched his face, and 3 seconds into the calls, she saw his shoulders change a release of tension so long held that the change was visible across the room. He ended the call. The examiner has flagged the fabricated document for further review, he said. The preliminary finding is suspended pending authentication. Gerald exhaled. Lena set down her pen. Suspended, she said. Not cleared, Marcus said. Not yet, but suspended. The investigation doesn't move forward while the authentication is pending. How long? 5 to 10 business days for the authentication review. Which means the board session happened hence before the investigation resumes, she said. Yes, she looked at the table, at the remains of the sandwich, at Calvin's 19-page analysis sitting in a neat stack beside her laptop, at the accumulated debris of 3 days of compressed, relentless work. Tish is going to find out within the hour, she said. Yes. When he does, he moves. Whatever he has left, he deploys before the board session. What does he have left? Gerald said. He has 3 days, she said. And he's the kind of man who is always prepared more than he's shown. She looked at Marcus. We need to know what we don't know. What can Tish still do? Marcus was quiet for a moment. The productive quiet. He can go to the press directly, Marcus said. The planted narrative, my involvement in the first phase, the appearance of continuity, it doesn't need the federal finding to land. He can give the story to a journalist with enough documentation to make it look credible. He does that, and Calvin's analysis counters it, Gerald said. Calvin's analysis is 9 pages of forensic accounting, Lena said. A press narrative is 300 words with a headline. The headline wins the first 24 hours, regardless of what the analysis says. She paused. What else? Kessler, Marcus said. She looked at him. Kessler gave us his documents. But Kessler is also a frightened man who has been on Tish's payroll for 22 months. If Tish approaches him with enough pressure, he recants, she said. Or he disappears, becomes unavailable, takes a sudden health-related leave. Marcus's voice was flat. Either way, his documents without his testimony are harder to use. Can we take his statement today? Gerald said. I'll call Constance Park, Lena said. Adrian's attorney had been in contact all morning. She has the relationship with Kessler. If we can get a formal sworn statement before Tish gets to him. Her phone buzzed on the table. She looked at the screen. Adrian. She answered it. He knows. Adrian's voice was different from any version of it she'd heard before. Strict, urgent, none of the layers. Tish knows about the server. I don't know how. I haven't told anyone. But he called me 20 minutes ago and a sound on the line that might have been Adrian steadying himself. He told me that if I provide those records to your attorney, he'll ensure that every criminal liability in the scheme lands on me and me alone. He said he has enough documentation to make any cooperation I provide look like self-interested fabrication. Where are you right now? She said, my apartment. Don't go to the Vale Consolidated building. Don't take any calls from anyone connected to the company. You don't understand. His voice cracked on the last word. Not from emotion, from the specific strain of someone holding something together that doesn't want to be held. He said he has a recording. From the meeting last night. Audio from that room. The room was suddenly very still. Lena looked at Marcus. Marcus's face had gone to stone. That room is supposed to be secure, she said to Marcus, low and fast. It is, Marcus said. The certainty in his voice had a fracture in it for the first time. He has audio, Adrian said. He played me 30 seconds of it. Us in that room, all three of us. What 30 seconds, she said. Silence for a moment. Then you telling me what you'd need from me if the board session went wrong. The part where you said whatever Adrian participated in knowingly was a legal matter and you weren't his attorney. A pause. Out of context, it sounds like you were preparing me for prosecution. Like you and my father brought me into that room to build a case against me. She breathed. She understood exactly what Tish had done. 30 seconds of audio, real audio, authentic recording, nothing fabricated. Just cropped at the precise points that removed context and created a completely different meaning. Adrian, she said, listen to me carefully. I'm listening. You still have access to the server? Yes. Has anything changed on it? Any files moved, modified, deleted? No. I checked 20 minutes ago. Then here's what happened, she said. You call Constance Park right now. Not after this call. Right now. You tell her Tish has threatened you with criminal liability and is using audio recordings to obstruct your cooperation. She files an emergency motion in the next 2 hours documenting the obstruction attempt. She paused. And you transfer the server contents to Gerald Marsh's secure system in the next 60 minutes. Before Tish can get anywhere near those records. If I do that, you protect yourself, she said. The obstruction filing creates a record of Tish's threat. The server records establish what you actually authorized versus what he's attributed to you. Your cooperation, documented before the board session, is the best evidence you have that you understood what Tish was actually doing. Silence. He'll destroy me, Adrian said quietly. He was already planning to, she said. The only question is whether you're standing when it happens. A long pause. Okay, Adrian said. Call Constance. Now. The line went dead. The next 90 minutes were the most concentrated work of the entire 3 days. Gerald coordinating with Constance Park on the obstruction filing. Calvin compiling a supplementary analysis connecting the audio manipulation technique to Tish's pattern of evidence distortion. Lena on the phone with Priya, who had spent the morning quietly and systematically building a complete digital record of every document discrepancy in the Hart Compliance Solutions fabrications, creating a chronological map that showed Tish's construction method evolving across all 3 document sets. Priya, who was 26 years old and worked with a precision that made Lena profoundly grateful, had also found something else. She called Lena at 3:45. The audio system in Marcus's private floor, Priya said. I was looking at the building's vendor contracts public records. The building files them as part of their city permits. The security system installer for that floor renewed a maintenance contract 8 months ago. Priya, the vendor company, is a subsidiary, she said. 2 layers of holding structure. The ultimate parent entity is registered in Delaware. Lena went very still. Tell me the parent entity, she said. A company called Meridian Technical Solutions, Priya said. Incorporated 11 years ago. 11 years. The same year Tish joined Vale Consolidated. He installed the surveillance system himself, Lena said. 8 months ago, Priya said. Before the board petition. Before any of this became visible. He was recording that room for 8 months, Lena said. Every conversation Marcus had in that space. Every conversation, Priya said. She stood in the middle of Marcus's main room, where Marcus and Gerald were both watching her face, and she said to Priya, Send me the corporate records. All of them. In the next 10 minutes, she ended the call. She looked at Marcus. Your private floor, she said. The secure room you've been using for confidential conversations for 20 years. He read her face. Tish has been recording it, he said. For 8 months. The vendor company for your security system is ultimately controlled by a Tish entity. Marcus's expression didn't crumble. It went somewhere past, harder and colder than she'd seen from him. The specific look of a man who has just confirmed that the betrayal went deeper than he thought and has decided in real time what to do with that information. Everything, he said. Every conversation in that room for 8 months. Yes. Then he has audio we haven't seen, not just last night. Months of it, she said. Board strategy conversations. Legal discussions. Whatever you've had in that room since last November. Gerald said quietly, this is actually the mechanism. She looked at him. Tish isn't planning to use the audio as evidence in a legal proceeding, Gerald said. He's planning to use it selectively in the press. 30 seconds here, a minute there, released in sequence before and during the board session, creating a rolling narrative, each release contradicting the last public statement, keeping Marcus in reactive mode, keeping the board members uncertain. Death by installment, she said. He doesn't need to win any single news cycle, Gerald said. He needs enough chaos that the board session happens in a context of total institutional doubt. Lena looked at Marcus. The board session is in 3 days, she said. We cannot spend those 3 days reacting to whatever he releases. We have to go forward. How? Marcus said. She thought for exactly 4 seconds. We release everything first, she said. Tonight. Not selectively. Everything. The complete picture of the fraud structure, the fabricated documents, the federal examiner's suspended finding, the Meridian technical vendor connection, the Kessler payments, Adrian's server records. She paused. All of it simultaneously to 3 publications. The full story documented before Tish can control the sequence. That exposes Adrian, Gerald said. It exposes what Adrian did and what was done to him, she said, which is not the same thing, and the difference is visible in the records. It exposes the first phase of the restructuring, Gerald said. Marcus's name on the original authorization, along with Calvin's analysis showing the fabricated insertion point and the clean break between Marcus's authorization and Tish's fraud. She looked at Gerald. Context isn't a footnote, it's the whole story. The board members will have read everything before the session, Marcus said. That's the point, she said. I don't want them walking into that room uncertain. I want them walking in with the complete picture already established, Tish's manipulation already documented, and their decision already halfway made. She looked around the room at Marcus, at Gerald, at Calvin still at his workstation. We are not waiting for the board session to be the moment of revelation, she said. The board session is the formality. The revelation happens tonight. Gerald looked at her for a long moment. The publication we use matters, he said. It needs to be a financial outlet with enough credibility that the story lands as reporting, not as a PR offensive. I have 2 contacts, she said. Real reporters. The kind who will verify independently before publishing. She pulled up her phone. I need 4 hours to brief them, which means I need to start making calls in the next 20 minutes. Lena Marcus said her name with the particular weight of someone who has something to say that they're not sure of the right to say. She looked at him. If this goes wrong, he said, if the publications get cold feet or Tish comes with his own release, or the board members read the full story and decide the entire Vale name is too compromised to salvage, then we'll have done it anyway, she said, because doing it anyway is the only thing that gives us any chance at all. He looked at her. The evening light through the windows was going amber and long, the specific late afternoon light that makes a city look briefly like it might be forgivable. You don't owe this to me, he said. What you're about to do the risk to your firms, standing up at a board session with your name on documents that haven't been fully cleared. I know what I owe and what I don't, she said. This isn't about owing. Then what is it about? She picked up her phone. It's about the fact that I'm very good at my job, she said, and Tish built his whole plan on the assumption that I wasn't. She dialed the first number. The calls took 3.5 hours. 2 financial journalists, both known to her professionally, both the kind of reporters who had spent careers building the specific credibility that made them worth calling when the stakes were real. She briefed them in parallel, Gerald handling the document transfer to each, Calvin available by phone for technical questions, Lena on with each journalist in overlapping windows, her voice steady through all of it, because she decided at the beginning of the call that steady was what the situation required, and she was going to give the situation what it required. By 8 p.m., both journalists had confirmed they would publish simultaneously at 6 a.m. the following morning. They needed the night to verify independently, calling Marcus's attorney, calling Gerald, cross-referencing the federal examiner's docket. That was correct procedure, and she respected it. By 8:30, Adrian's server records had been transferred to Gerald's secure system, and Constance Park had filed the obstruction motion documenting Tish's threat. By 9, Priya had submitted the complete heart compliance solutions forensic documentation to FINRA's Investigation Review Office, with a cover letter from Gerald formally challenging the evidentiary basis of the filing. By 9:15, Lena was sitting alone in Marcus's boardroom. Everyone else tapped out for various calls, and she was looking at the city through the window and feeling the specific exhaustion that lives on the other side of sustained high function. Not collapse, not relief. The particular hollowness of someone who has used everything they have and is now waiting to find out if it was enough. Marcus came back into the room. He sat down across from her, not at the head of the table. Across from her, the way they'd sat in the diner, which felt like a different era of the same life. He set a cup of coffee in front of her. She looked at it. "It's from the machine down the hall," he said. "It's terrible." She picked it up and drank it. "The board session is at 9 a.m. the day after tomorrow," she said. "Yes. Tish will know about the publications by 6:01 a.m. By 7, he'll be deploying whatever response he has prepared." "Yes." Which means the hour between publication and his response is the only window where the story exists on our terms. "Yes." He looked at her. "You've thought about every contingency." "I've thought about the ones I can see," she said. "The ones I can't see are the ones that keep me up at night." "What don't you think you can see?" She was quiet for a moment. "Tish has been doing this for 11 years, she said. "He's methodical and patient and very smart. We've countered everything he's deployed so far. Which means either we're actually ahead of him," she stopped, Marcus said. "Or he still has something we haven't found," she said. "And he's been waiting for the moment when we're most certain we've won." The room was very quiet. Outside, the city was its nighttime self lit differently, moving differently. The specific sound of a large place after dark that was nothing like the sound of the same place at noon. "Tomorrow morning," Lena said, "when those publications go live, Tish will know we've released everything. He'll know his sequenced narrative strategy is finished. And he'll know that the board session is going to happen in a room where the members have already read the full story." "Yes," Marcus said. "A man like that," she said, "doesn't accept that position. He pivots." "To what?" She looked at her coffee cup. "That's the question I can't answer," she said. "And the fact that I can't answer it is the only thing in this entire situation that actually scares me." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. "I should have told you about the first phase," he said. "Not for the first time tonight. But differently, not the acknowledgement of a man correcting a strategic error, but the admission of a man who understood that the error had a human cost." "You should have," she said. "I was afraid you'd walk." "I know, that was my judgment about your capacity," he said. "I decided what you could handle instead of telling you the truth and letting you decide." She looked at him directly. "The next time you decide what I can handle," she said, "I will walk. Not because of what you withheld. Because of what that kind of withholding means." "Understood," he said. "I need you to mean that. I do." She studied his face. The specific quality of his expression at that moment, not managed, not calculated, not performing certainty he didn't have. She believed him. She wasn't sure that belief was rational. She wasn't sure it mattered whether it was rational. Her phone vibrated on the table. She looked at the screen. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize. No name. Just a message, 6 words, "Check the Heart Compliance Solutions server." She picked up the phone and showed Marcus the screen. He looked at it. She was already dialing Priya. Priya answered in one ring. "Our server," Lena said. "Right now." "Has anything changed in the last 2 hours?" The sound of Priya typing. Fast. Then a silence that lasted 3 seconds longer than it should have. "Lena," Priya's voice had changed. "Tell me." "There's an access log entry," Priya said. 40 minutes ago. An external IP. Something got into the client database." A pause. "It shows an export," Priya said. "The complete client record database. 8 years of client files, engagement letters, financial documentation for every client Heart Compliance Solutions has ever served." The cold that moved through her was total. "How?" she said. "I don't know yet," Priya said. "The access point is it's using credentials. Valid credentials. Your credentials, Lena, your login." She stared at the wall. I haven't logged into that system today, she said. I know, Priya said, but someone did. Marcus was watching her face. She lowered the phone. 8 years of client files, confidential financial records for every bank, every investment fund, every mid-sized company that had ever trusted Hart-compliant solutions with their most sensitive documentation. If that data was now in Tish's hands, if he released it, if he threatened to release it, if he used it as leverage against her clients directly, it wasn't just her firm. It was every person who had ever trusted her. This is what we couldn't see, she said. Marcus said nothing. He didn't go after my evidence, she said. He went after my clients. She looked at Marcus, the room, the city, outside, the coffee going cold on the table between them. If he releases that data, she said, or threatens to, I can't walk into that board session. I can't stand up in front of those 9 directors and present evidence while 8 years of confidential client records are being held over my head. Because the moment I do, Tish uses the threat to show every client I've ever had that their data is at risk because I dragged them into a Vail family war. He forces you to choose, Marcus said. The board session or my clients, she said. She stood up. Her hands were not shaking. She made note of that. Later, she thought she would probably be grateful for that. How long do I have? She said to Priya on the phone. Before he uses it? Priya said. I don't know. But the export happened 40 minutes ago. If he was going to use it immediately, we'd probably know already. He's waiting, Lena said. He's giving me time to find out. Time to sit with it. She understood the strategy completely. He wants me to spend tonight in exactly this position, knowing what he has, knowing what it means, unable to sleep, unable to plan, just sitting with the weight of it until morning. What do we do? Priya said. She looked at Marcus. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the gravity of a man managing a crisis. Something quieter and more uncertain than that. The look of a man who has run out of moves and knows it, and is watching someone else to see whether they have one left. Call our clients, she said to Priya. Every active client. Tonight. I don't care about the hour. Call them. Tell them we have identified a potential data security incident. Tell them we are actively investigating. Tell them their confidentiality is our first priority, and we will have a full briefing for them within 24 hours. That's 43 calls, Priya said. Then start now, she said. And Priya, do not tell them it's related to Vail Consolidated. Not yet. Let them hear the full story from us in order with context. Priya said. The line went quiet. Lena set her phone on the table. She stood in the center of the room, Marcus's building, a situation that had started with her name on documents she hadn't signed and had arrived here. 3 days later, at a point where every person who had ever trusted her was now collateral in someone else's war. She thought about the text from the unknown number. Check the Hart-compliant solutions server. Tish telling her what he'd done. Not gloating, informing. Giving her exactly enough information to understand her position without enough time to fully recover before morning. She thought about the board session 2 days away. She thought about every contingency she'd planned for and the one she hadn't. She looked at Marcus. You don't owe me anything, she said. I want to be clear about that. Whatever happens from here, this situation found you before it found me, and nothing that comes next is a debt. Lena, I need you to hear that, she said. Because what I'm about to say has to come from me, not from strategy, not from whatever we've built in the last 3 days that neither of us has named. He was very still. I'm not leaving, she said. Not tonight. Not tomorrow, not because of this. She held his gaze. Tish wants me to choose between the board session and my clients. And what he hasn't understood, what none of them have understood, not Adrian, not Tish, is that I don't make decisions because I've been cornered into them. She picked up her phone. I need to make one more call, she said. And then we need to be at that board session in 42 hours ready to end this. One more call to who? Marcus said. She looked at him. To the one person in this entire situation. She said, who has every reason to want Raymond Tish destroyed, and who, until tonight, we haven't asked for anything. Marcus understood a second before she said it. Adrian, they said simultaneously. She dialed. This is a work of complete fiction, created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, organizations, events, and locations are entirely invented. Part 5, Adrian picked up on the third ring. He sounded like a man who had not slept and had stopped pretending he might. I know, he said, before she could speak. I heard about the server breach 20 minutes ago. Constance got a notification from our monitoring system. The access point used your credentials, but the IP traces back to the same Meridian technical infrastructure. Same vendor company Tish used for the surveillance system, Lena said. He's had a back door into your firm's systems for months, Adrian said. Probably since he identified you as the compliance entity he was going to use. A pause. He planned for you specifically, Lena. Long before you knew any of this existed. She absorbed that, filed it, moved past it. I need something from you, she said. And I need you to understand that what I'm asking doesn't reduce your legal exposure or change what you're going to have to account for. I'm not offering you a deal. I'm asking you for a choice. Silence. The audio Tish has from the surveillance system, she said. He's been recording that room for 8 months, which means he has everything. Board strategy conversations, legal discussions, private admissions, Marcus made in a space he believed was secure. Yes, Adrian said. That audio is Tish's final weapon. He uses it in sequence releases pieces to the press during the board session, creating enough chaos that the vote becomes impossible to hold cleanly. She paused. Unless the audio is already public. All of it. In full context before Tish can edit and sequence it. A long silence. You want to release 8 months of recordings, Adrian said. Every conversation from that room. Unedited. With a documented explanation of how the surveillance system was installed and who controls it. She paused. It exposes a lot. Things Marcus said privately. Things that may be uncomfortable. Things Adrian said yes. Another silence. She waited it out. There's a conversation from 4 months ago, Adrian said slowly. In that room. Marcus and I, we had the version of the fight we'd been building toward for 20 years. Things were said. He stopped. Not illegal things. Personal things. The kind of things that should have stayed private. I know, she said. If that goes public, it goes public on your terms, she said, with context, as part of the complete picture of what Tish built and how he used it. Not as a weapon Tish deploys at the precise moment designed to cause maximum damage. The line was quiet for a long time. She looked at Marcus across the room. He was listening, not speaking, honoring the boundary she'd asked him to keep. He used me, Adrian said. Not with heat. With the flat, exhausted quality of someone saying something they've been working toward for hours and have finally arrived at. Yes, she said. I let him, Adrian said. You made choices that made it possible, she said. That's different from letting him. You didn't know the full architecture. I knew enough, Adrian said. I knew more than I admitted to myself because admitting it would have meant admitting I'd built something ugly. A pause. I wanted the company. I wanted to prove I could run what my father built. And I told myself that the method was temporary, that I'd clean it up once I had the position, that the people who got caught in the margins would be fine. You thought I'd be fine, she said. Yes, he said quietly. I'm sorry, that's not enough. I know it's not. She didn't tell him it was. She didn't tell him it wasn't. The board session is in 2 days, she said. I need to know if you'll do this. A silence that lasted long enough that she wondered if the line had dropped. Yes, Adrian said, send me the protocol. She slept 3 hours. Real sleep, this time not fitful, not surface level, but the deep, immediate unconsciousness of someone whose body has finally overridden everything else and claimed what it needs. She woke at 4:30 a.m. with the specific clarity that sometimes comes from insufficient sleep taken at the right moment, a sharpness that she knew from experience wouldn't last more than a few hours and needed to be used. She lay in the dark and ran through the plan. At 6 a.m., the 2 financial publications would run the full stories simultaneously. Every document, every analysis, the Meridian technical connection, the fabricated insertion in the federal records, the FINRA challenge, the complete picture, sourced and verified, in the public record before Tish could sequence his own narrative. At 6:30, Priya and her team would send a direct communication to every Heart Compliance Solutions client, the full briefing, the explanation of the breach, the documented evidence that the intrusion had been conducted by an external actor using fabricated credentials. 43 calls and emails, personal and direct, because the clients deserved to hear it from Lena's firm before they read it in the news. At 7, Adrian's attorney would file the full surveillance system documentation with the Federal Comber Examiner's Office, the corporate structure of Meridian Technical, the vendor contract, the 8 months of recording logs establishing that the originals package filed by Tish had been compiled using materials gathered through illegal surveillance of a named party's private communications. That last piece was the one that would unravel Tish's case against Marcus entirely. Because the federal examiner couldn't use records obtained through an illegal surveillance operation as the evidentiary basis for an investigation. Whatever the originals contained, including the fabricated authorization document Calvin had identified the entire package, was now tainted by the method of its collection. Tish had been so focused on building the architecture of the evidence that he'd exposed the architecture of how he'd obtained it. She thought about that in the dark of her bedroom. The patience of the man, 11 years. Building a position inside someone else's company, learning its structure from the inside, placing surveillance in a private room, constructing 3 separate document sets, corrupting a board member, managing a founder's son as a disposable instrument. All of it pointing toward a single moment, the board session, where he would step into the vacuum he'd created and present himself as the only stable option. It was almost elegant, and it had required at every stage that the people around him continue to underestimate the people he was using as tools. He'd underestimated Lena. She got up at 4:45 and made coffee and sat at her kitchen table in the dark and waited for 6 a.m. The publications went live at 6:02. She knew because her phone started moving at 6:03, not Tish, not Adrian, not Marcus. Her clients, the ones who were already awake, already reading, already processing the story with the specific focus of people who had trusted a firm with their most financial documentation and were now reading that firm's name in a major financial publication alongside the words fraud, fabrication, and federal investigation. She answered every call herself. All 43, she'd told Priya. No voicemail, no assistance. If a client called, Lena answered. It took 4 hours. Some calls were brief 3 minutes, a confirmation that the breach was contained, that their specific data had not been weaponized, that the investigation was active, and they would receive documentation by end of day. Some calls were longer. One client, a regional bank president she'd worked with for 6 years, a careful man who chose his words like he was on the line for 22 minutes, asking the kind of questions that deserved real answers, and she gave him real answers, including the ones that reflected badly on her judgment in the weeks before she'd known what she was inside. She didn't perform certainty she didn't have. She didn't oversell the resolution. She said, "This happened. Here is the full truth of it. Here is what we are doing about it. And here is what it means for you specifically." At the end of that call, the bank president said, "I've worked with a lot of compliance consultants. Most of them would have let the PR team handle this. I don't have a PR team," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I called you 6 years ago." At 9:15 a.m., Raymond Tisch's attorney filed a motion challenging the publication of confidential corporate records. Gerald had anticipated this. The challenge was filed by 10, dismissed by 11, because the records were already in the public domain, and the publication had been conducted through legitimate press channels with verified sourcing. At 11:40, the Federal Examiner's Office issued a statement confirming that the investigation into Marcus Vail had been suspended pending a review of the evidentiary collection methods. No timeline given. No preliminary findings issued. At 12:30, Howard Kessler gave his formal sworn statement to Gerald Marsh. He arrived at Gerald's office looking like a man who had made a decision he wasn't proud of and had decided to make it anyway. He was in the room for 2 hours. He answered every question. He did not minimize his involvement. When Gerald asked him why he'd decided to come forward, Kessler was quiet for a moment and then said, "Because I'm 71 years old and I don't want the last significant thing I do to be helping Raymond Tisch." At 2 p.m., Tisch issued a public statement through his attorney, denying all allegations and asserting that the publications constituted a coordinated campaign of defamation orchestrated by Marcus Vail and his associates. At 2:47, Adrian Vail's attorney released the full surveillance documentation to 3 additional publications, along with a statement from Adrian confirming that he had cooperated with the federal investigation, and that his cooperation included providing access to a private server containing 18 months of unaltered transaction records. The statement acknowledged that Adrian had participated in conduct that was under federal review. It did not attempt to minimize that. It framed his cooperation as a choice he'd made when he understood the full scope of what had been built around him. Constance Park had written it. It was clean and specific and entirely without self-pity, and Lena read it twice and thought that it was probably the most honest public thing Adrian Vail had ever said. The board session convened at 9 a.m. the following morning in Vail Consolidated's primary conference room, 31st floor. Long table, 9 chairs arranged with the particular formality of a proceeding that understood its own significance. Lena arrived at 8:40 with Gerald beside her and Calvin's full forensic report in a bound document under her arm. She wore a charcoal suit she'd had for 4 years because it fit correctly and she didn't have time to think about anything that wasn't load-bearing. Marcus was already in the room. He looked like a man who had slept adequately and decided to carry himself accordingly, regardless of how he felt. The silver in his hair, the set of his shoulders, the way he stood at the window not performing authority, just occupying the space he'd occupied for 30 years without apology. He looked at her when she came in. She gave him a small nod. Nothing more. The board members filed in between 8:50 and 9:05. 7 of them. 2 chairs remained empty. Howard Kessler's chair was empty because Kessler had tendered his resignation the previous afternoon, citing personal health reasons, with a private letter to Marcus that Gerald had been copied on, which contained 4 paragraphs of the most carefully worded apology Lena had ever read from someone who couldn't afford to be too direct. Raymond Tisch's chair was empty because at 8:22 that morning, federal agents had arrived at his home and taken him into custody, pending formal charges of securities fraud, conspiracy, wire fraud, and illegal surveillance of private communications. She'd found out about the arrest at 8:30 from Gerald, who'd gotten a call from the federal examiner's office. She'd stood in the lobby of the Vail Consolidated building, holding her phone and let the information land, and then put her phone in her bag and walked to the elevator. The board session proceeded. It lasted 3 hours and 14 minutes. Gerald presented the forensic documentation. Calvin presented the technical analysis. Marcus's attorney presented the timeline of the legitimate restructuring and the subsequent fraud. Adrian's server records were entered into evidence through Constance Park, who appeared by video link with the compressed professionalism of someone who had been awake for 36 hours and intended for no one to notice. Lena presented her firm's analysis. She stood at the head of the table and spoke for 41 minutes without notes, because she'd been living inside this documentation for 4 days, and she knew every number, every date, every account designation, every discrepancy between what the fabricated records claimed and what the authentic records showed. She spoke to the board members the way she spoke to clients, who needed to understand something complex and important, directly, without performance, with the specific respect of a professional who believes the people she's addressing are capable of understanding what she's telling them, if she tells it clearly. At one point, the financial industry representative, a man named Garrett, whom she'd never met, who had spent the entire morning making notes with a gold pen, put his pen down and looked at her and said, "Ms. Hart, in your professional assessment, is there any version of these records that exculpates Raymond Tisch?" "No," she said. "Is there any version that implicates Marcus Vail beyond the original authorized restructuring?" "Not in the authentic records," she said. "The only document that attempts to establish that continuity has been forensically identified as a fabrication inserted into the original package after the fact." Garrett picked up his pen. "Thank you," he said. The vote was 7-0. Raymond Tisch's seat abstained by absence. Howard Kessler's seat had been vacated. The remaining 7 board members voted to affirm Marcus Vail's continued leadership, remove the contested subsidiary structures from the company's active accounts pending federal review, and commission an independent external audit of all Vail consolidated financial records for the preceding 3 years. The session closed at 12:19 p.m. Lena walked out into the hallway and stood there for a moment. The hallway was empty, carpeted, the same ambient quiet of a building where important decisions happened at regular intervals, and the architecture had been designed to absorb them. She leaned against the wall. Not dramatically. She just needed the wall behind her for 30 seconds. Gerald came out and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He'd been a federal prosecutor for 12 years and a private attorney for 18 more, and he understood the specific 30 seconds that followed the end of something this large, and he gave it to her without trying to fill it. "FINRA," she said. "Their review period runs another 22 days, he said. "With the complete forensic package and the federal arrest, I expect the investigation to be formally withdrawn within the week. And our clients? 39 of the 43 have confirmed they're staying. 3 are in discussion. 1," he paused. "1 is ending the relationship. Not because they don't believe the breach was external. Because the exposure made their board uncomfortable." She nodded. "That's fair," she said. "It is," Gerald said. "You want me to make the call, or do you want to handle it yourself?" "I'll handle it," she said, "this afternoon." He nodded. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder, a gesture she registered as genuine rather than performed, which was the only kind she had any patience for, and then he walked down the hall toward the elevator bank. She stayed at the wall. The door to the conference room opened. Marcus came out. He stopped when he saw her, didn't approach. Just stood there in the hallway with the particular stillness she'd come to recognize as his authentic state, not managed, not measured, just present. It's done, she said. Yes, he said. How does it feel? He thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, which was something she'd noticed about him from the first night, the specific quality of a man who didn't reach for the available answer when the accurate one required more time. Like something I'm going to have to sit with for a long time, he said. What it cost, what it could have been if I'd built it differently. He paused. And like something that right now I'm genuinely glad is over. She looked at him. What happens to Adrian, she said. Federal cooperation doesn't eliminate exposure. It reduces it. He was careful with the words. His attorney believes the cooperation, combined with the evidence establishing that he was himself a target of Tish's manipulation, will result in a settlement rather than prosecution. Restrictions, fines, likely a prohibition from certain financial activities for a period. He paused. He won't go to prison. Is that the right outcome? Marcus was quiet for a moment. I don't know, he said. I don't think I'm the right person to make that assessment. No, she said, you're not. They stood in the hallway. The building went about its business around them, elevator doors opening and closing at the far end, someone's phone ringing briefly and being silenced, the distant sound of the city 31 floors below. I need to go back to my office, she said. There's a client call this afternoon, and Priya has been managing a staff meeting that I've been absent from for 4 days. Of course, he said. She picked up her bag, adjusted the strap on her shoulder. Looked at him, Marcus. Yes. The first phase, she said. The restructuring you authorized that Tish used as the template. I need to know that you've been fully transparent with your attorney and with the federal examiner about the extent of your knowledge of how that structure was subsequently used. I have been, he said. Everything. Not the version that protects your position. Everything. Everything, he said. I gave them a full account 3 days ago, before the board session, before any of this was resolved. He met her eyes. Not because I knew how the session would go. Because it was the right thing to do. She studied him. She believed him. She wasn't sure that made everything that had come before it right. She wasn't sure belief worked that cleanly. But she believed this specific thing, in this specific moment, and that was what she had to work with. Okay, she said. She walked toward the elevator. Lena. She turned. He was still in the hallway, standing where she'd left him, and he looked like what he was, a man in his 60s who had built something enormous and watched it be almost taken from him, and was still standing, which was not nothing, but also was not the whole story. Thank you, he said. Not for the board session. For sitting in that diner 4 days ago and choosing to stay in the room. She looked at him for a moment. Don't thank me for that, she said. I did it for my company. I know, he said. That's why it meant something. She turned and pressed the elevator button. The doors opened. She went home. 3 weeks passed before she saw Marcus again. Not because there was an agreement to stay apart. There was no agreement, no dramatic decision, no charged conversation about space and distance. Life simply resumed at the pace that it resumes after a sustained crisis, quickly in some ways, slowly in others, with the specific disorientation of someone whose entire sensory bandwidth has been occupied at maximum capacity for days and then suddenly isn't. She went back to work. Heart Compliance Solutions had lost one client and was in active conversation with the 3 who were undecided. By the end of the first week, 2 of those 3 had confirmed they were staying. The third took another 10 days, and when he finally called, he said, I needed to watch how you handled the fallout before I decided. You handled it the right way. She thanked him. She meant it. Priya had managed the office through the 4-day crisis with a competence that went significantly beyond her job description, and Lena addressed this directly in terms of responsibility, in terms of title, in terms of what Priya was going to be compensated for going forward. The conversation lasted 12 minutes. Priya cried briefly and then recovered with the speed of someone who was embarrassed by the crying, but not by what had caused it. The FINRA investigation was formally withdrawn on day 17. Calvin's full forensic package, the federal arrest of Raymond Tish, and the documented evidence of fabrication had collectively removed every evidentiary basis for the filing. The withdrawal letter was 4 paragraphs and entirely procedural, which was exactly what she wanted: no drama, no ceremony. Just a formal record that Heart Compliance Solutions had been cleared. She framed the letter. Not prominently, she put it in the bottom drawer of her filing cabinet, where she kept the documents that mattered but didn't need to be displayed. She thought about putting it on the wall and decided against it. The past 4 years had taught her that the things you needed to see every day were different from the things you needed to know existed. Raymond Tish was indicted on 14 counts. She read the indictment on a Tuesday morning with her second coffee, going through it with the professional attention of someone who understood how these documents worked and wanted to verify that the architecture of what had been charged accurately reflected the architecture of what had actually been built. It did. 14 counts: securities fraud, conspiracy to commit securities fraud, wire fraud, illegal surveillance, obstruction of justice, and 6 counts related to the fabrication and submission of fraudulent financial records to a federal examiner. His attorney entered a not guilty plea, which was expected, and the case was assigned a trial date 14 months out. She set the document down and drank her coffee and looked out the window of her office at the city, which was doing what it always did, operating, continuous, entirely indifferent to the specific drama that had played out inside its frames over the past 3 weeks. She felt something she hadn't fully felt until that morning. Not relief. Relief had come in pieces when the board voted, when the FINRA withdrawal arrived, when the last undecided client called. What she felt now was something slower and more fundamental. The specific weight of an experience that was fully over, settling into the place in her history where things go when you're done surviving them and have to figure out what they mean. She thought about what it had cost. 4 days of concentrated work that had required everything she had. A data breach that had exposed her client's trust to a risk they hadn't consented to. One client lost. Her name in publication she'd spent 8 years keeping it out of. The end of a 4-year relationship and the particular inventory taking that followed what she'd missed, what she'd rationalized, what she'd known on some level and hadn't let herself name. She thought about what it had clarified, the work itself. She was good at it, genuinely good. Not good in the qualified way that women in her field were often told they were good, as though the competence were surprising and required constant acknowledgement. Just good. The 4 days had been the most difficult professional situation of her life, and she'd moved through it with a clarity of judgment that she felt privately she could be honest about. The people. She thought about Priya, about Gerald, about Calvin, who had produced 19 pages of forensic analysis under impossible time pressure, and whose only comment on the final outcome had been to send her an email that said, "Good result. Invoice to follow." She thought about Adrian. She hadn't spoken to him since the night of the server breach, when he'd agreed to release the documentation. She'd read his public statement, and she'd seen the photos of him outside his attorney's office the day after the board session, not looking like a man who'd gotten away with something, but like a man in the early stages of understanding what he'd actually done. She didn't feel sorry for him. She didn't feel vindicated by his situation. She felt the specific complicated thing you feel for someone who could have been decent and chose not to be, and who is now having to learn the cost of that choice in a very specific and public way. She hoped he'd learn it, not for her sake, for his own. She thought last and most carefully about Marcus. He called on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks and 2 days after the board session. He said, "I'd like to see you." Not about the company. Not about any of the legal proceedings. Just to see you. If that's something you want. She said, "What would we talk about?" He said, "I don't know yet." That seems like a reasonable reason to find out. She was quiet for a moment. "Saturday," she said. "Same diner." He said, "I'll be there." She arrived 5 minutes early and took the same booth. The same laminate countertops, the same coffee that had been on the burner too long, the same window with the same view of the street where people went about the ordinary business of being alive. Marcus arrived at the agreed time. He saw her in the booth and walked directly over and sat down without the social performance of arrival, no extended greeting, no commentary on the place. He just sat across from her and looked at her and said, "How are you?" "Better than 3 weeks ago," she said. "Worse than I probably look." "What does worse look like?" "Tired," she said, still sorting through what the past month was. She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. There's an adjustment period after something like this, where the pace of normal life feels strange because your nervous system is still calibrated for crisis. How long does it last? In my experience? She thought about it. Longer than it should, he nodded. He ordered coffee when the server came. He didn't ask her anything else for a moment, and she registered that as the thing she'd noted about him from the beginning, the ability to sit in silence without filling it, which was rarer than people understood. "The company," she said, "the restructuring is underway. The independent board audit starts next month." He paused. "I've appointed an interim CEO, someone external, someone who has no prior relationship with Vail Consolidated's politics. And the long term? I'm going to run it differently than I ran it before." He said it without drama. The structure that allowed what Tish built to exist for 14 months without detection, that's a structural failure, not just a personal betrayal. I created conditions that made it possible. That has to change. It will take time, she said. Yes. A pause. I have time. She looked at him. Adrian is going to Montana, Marcus said. He has a friend there, someone from before the company years. He's going to spend some time away from the industry. A pause. We spoke. Last week, for the first time in a long time where neither of us was managing the conversation. How was it? Hard, he said. Also not nothing. I don't know what it will become. But it wasn't nothing. She nodded. He told me something, Marcus said. About you. She waited. He said you were the only person in the entire situation who told him the truth without needing him to respond to it in a particular way. That you laid out the facts and left the choice to him. Marcus looked at her. He said he hadn't experienced that before, and he didn't know how to recognize it until it was gone. She was quiet for a moment. He'll learn, she said. If he actually goes to Montana and actually stops performing for a while, he'll learn. Maybe, Marcus said. It's not your job to make sure he does, she said. I know. It's not your job to suffer for it if he doesn't either. He looked at her. Something in his face that she'd seen before, the specific shift of a man being told something he needed to hear from someone who had no reason to soften it. You've thought about that, he said. I've thought about a lot of things in the past 3 weeks, she said, including what it means to be a person who built their identity around something, the company, the legacy, the idea of what they were creating, and then had to reckon with what that single-pointed focus cost the people around them. You're talking about me. I'm talking about a pattern, she said, that I've observed in you and that I've observed in myself. In different ways. He was very still. You built a company at the expense of your family, she said. I built a company at the expense of paying attention to my own life. Neither of those things makes us bad people. But both of them are real and they have consequences. And I'd rather say that directly than let it sit under the surface of every conversation we have going forward. Going forward, he said. She heard what he'd registered and didn't look away from it. I don't know what that looks like, she said. I want to be honest about that. I don't know what I want from this, whatever this is. I know that I respect you. I know that you've shown me in the worst possible circumstances that you're capable of honesty when it costs you something. She paused. I also know that 4 days is not a foundation. It's a starting point. And starting points have to be built from. I know, he said. Slowly, she said, and on my terms as much as yours. Yes, he said. On your terms as much as mine. She looked at him. Why me, she said. Not insecurely, genuinely. You're 62 years old and you run a global company and you've known extraordinary people. Why sit in this diner across from a woman you've known for 4 days and ask to see where it goes? He considered the question the way he considered everything, with the full weight of his attention, not rushing towards the available answer. Because in 4 days, he said, you told me the truth 7 separate times when softening it would have been easier. You protected people who had no claim on your protection. You refused every version of this situation that would have given you an exit at someone else's expense. He paused. And when I gave you a reason not to trust me, you investigated it instead of walking away from it. I was investigating for my own purposes, she said. I know, he said. That's the part that meant something. She looked at the window, at the street outside, where 2 people were walking a large dog who had decided to stop, and the people had accepted this as a negotiation rather than a command, which seemed right to her, which seemed like the only way anything worth having actually worked.